Chapter 400. The Growth of the Rookie. In a dark and sturdy room, Derek Berg, who had feigned unconsciousness, suddenly rolled to his feet. His axe of hurricane had already been taken away by someone and sent for inspection. Every pocket on him had also been emptied out, leaving nothing behind. Derek took a breath and looked around steadily. Suddenly, his eyes lit up with two sun-like beams, causing everything in the room to be reflected clearly in his eyes. The furniture here consisted of only a table and two chairs. Apart from these, there was also a stone-paved floor with strange patterns on it. A half-used candle was placed on the table. This was standard issue for rooms in the City of Silver because monsters could suddenly appear if the darkness prevailed for too long. Without any hesitation, Derek sat down and reached for the candle. Then, he broke the candle and divided it into 3 sections. One was 3/4 the length of the original piece, and the other 2 were halved from the remaining quarter. After Derek's modification, the 3 candlesticks' cores were completely exposed. He rubbed his fingers together, creating a golden flame that lit up the 3 candles. The 2 at the top represented Mr. Fool, and the remaining one symbolized Derek himself. After finishing his preparations, Derek didn't continue to burn the herbal powder according to the normal processes. Instead, he poured in the essential oil and leaned back, softly chanting the honorific name of the Fool, and quickly entered cogitation. He read it over and over again, monotonously, as if he were hypnotizing himself. With the help of cogitation, Derek entered a strange state where his mind was in a deep sleep and the spirituality was dispersing. He felt adrift, but also seemed to maintain a strange lucidity. His psyche kept dispersing upwards as it rose in height. This was artificial sleepwalking. Derek, with the permission of Mr. Fool, could simplify some of the unnecessary steps. Above the gray fog, within the towering, ancient palace, Klein, who was fiddling with the all-black eye, suddenly saw the crimson star that symbolized little sun burgeon with light, condensing into a human shadow, and the power of the mysterious space was stirred a little. Upon seeing this, he couldn't help but feel relieved. This meant that Little Sun had already completed the relatively dangerous part of the operation, and he only needed to round up the situation. Klein didn't delay, and he immediately put down the all-black eye and picked up the Dark Emperor card. He instantly rose in level and authority, forcing the stirred power in the gray fog to submit to him. Then he picked up a paper figurine, flicked his wrist, and threw it towards the crimson star corresponding to the sun. The paper figurine and the flowing power intertwined and quickly expanded into a gigantic angel with 12 pairs of pitch-black wings. The angel pierced through the crimson light and overlapped with the illusory figure of Little Sunday. It silently combusted, turning into ashes in less than a second. At this point, Klein could no longer affect the situation of the City of Silver. As for whether his angel substitute could help Little Sun pass the subsequent inquiries and investigations, he lacked absolute confidence. He could only sigh inwardly. With what has to be done completed and with all the hard work put in, all you can do is wait for fate's arrangement. Hopefully it will be a good result. In a daze, Derek saw an angel descend before him with an aura that covered the heavens, wrapping him with 12 pairs of black wings. He suddenly came to his senses as 3 candles burned quietly in front of his eyes. After sincerely thanking Mr. Fool, Derek finished the ritual and extinguished the 2 candles which were part of the original quarter. Then he pulled them out and created a bright, golden flame in his palm. Drip, drip, drip. The 2 candles quickly melted, dripping its wax onto the remaining candle or the area surrounding it. When the candle burnt away completely, there was only 1 candle left on the table. It was shorter than before, but it wasn't very obvious. It seemed like it had only been burning for a short time. After removing the remaining traces, Derek extinguished the last yellow-flamed candle. He sat up in silence, staring ahead. For a long time, he didn't do anything. He was worried that the 6-member council wouldn't react fast enough, allowing the exploratory team members to corrupt more residents of the City of Silver with mushrooms and doom fruits. He was afraid that the chief and the others would find additional clues elsewhere, thwarting all his preparations. He hated those outsiders who lurked in the depths of the darkness, constantly carrying strong malice, including Amon and the fallen creator. He felt guilty that he had avoided the expedition without warning Dark and the rest, causing them to turn into corrupted monsters. He had painfully eliminated a classmate who could be considered a friend with his own hands. Although Derek didn't see Dark's ultimate end, he believed that a man who had transformed into that state was already no different from dead. Derek didn't know how long he waited while experiencing those mixed feelings. Midway, he even rekindled the candle. Finally, he heard the sound of the seal being removed and the door opening. Turning his head to look, he saw, with the aid of the dim yellow candlelight, a woman in a black skirt walk in. She had her hair tied up in a ponytail and it hung down to her vest. "Ma'am A-Floor," Derek subconsciously called out. A-Floor was a pretty woman, but she had wrinkles at the corners of her eyes. She smiled and nodded in response, then she walked over with light footsteps and sat down across him. "Do you have anything you wish to say?" she asked gently. Derek instinctively lifted his head and looked over, only to suddenly discover that her pupils had somehow turned into golden vertical slits. His mind went adrift as he seemed to enter a sleepwalking state. A-Floor adjusted the candle flame, letting the dim yellow light completely shine on the boy's face. Her pale golden pupils became increasingly indifferent, just like an emotionless audience. Suddenly, rings after rings of faint light appeared in those pale golden vertical pupils. It seemed to form a vortex and constructed a maze. In his stupor, Derek felt himself drifting away into the endless darkness and countless bright colors. At that moment, he suddenly became clear-headed. He felt as if something had ingeniously caught him in that state of reverie. He saw the flickering yellow candlelight and A-Floor sitting across him with her pale gold vertical pupils. In a corner's shadow, a grizzled chief, Elder Colin Iliad, walked out. After nodding to the chief, A-Floor asked Derek, "What have you been doing all this time?" Derek remembered his training and maintained the same state of mind as before. "I don't know. I've always been in a daze as if I was in a dream. Only occasionally will I have clearness of mind." At the same time as his reply, two complex dark green symbols appeared in Demon Hunter Colin's eyes. A-Floor continued, "Do you know that you had a conflict with Dark Regents?" "I only remember that we were fighting. I felt like I had seen a man hanging upside down on a cross and a man in a pointed hat and a crystal monocle. Yes, I saw him back at the dungeon." He had opened his mouth and spoke with a smile. Derek told a long story. A-Floor looked at the chief and pressed, "What did he say?" "I can't remember. I can only remember one thing," he said with a smile. "Fallen creator, true creator. Shepherd." Derek almost failed to control his excitement. He had taken such a risk just to tell the chief the name of the fallen creator, and that a shepherd was suspicious. The fallen creator. The true creator. It matches with the content on the murals at the bottom of the temple. Colin nodded slightly and whispered with a frown, "Shepherd, and then?" A-Floor's voice remained abnormally gentle. Derek answered in his stupor, "After that, they clashed, and there was a lot of light, very bright lights. Then, I woke up and kept coughing." The dark green symbols in Colin's eyes didn't fade this entire time as he motioned for Evelyn to ask about the details. Derek answered selectively, and he had pushed the blame onto Amon according to his script. He claimed amnesia on anything that went beyond that. Finally, A-Floor asked, "Where did you get the axe? Where did you get the Sun Pathways potion formula?" "I bought the axe from an underground market. That person was masked, and I could only tell that he was male. The Sun Pathway potion formula was left to me by my parents. They had discovered it during an expedition," Derek answered confidently. These were points of suspicion that had always been there, so the hanged man had assumed they were bound to ask them while he was questioned. Therefore, he had made Derek to repeatedly rehearse the answers. Although the City of Silver's underground market was semi-open, there were still people who tried to conceal their identities for a variety of reasons. This provided the best explanation for Derek. After A-Floor finished seriously listening to him, she turned her head sideways to Demon Hunter Colin and said, "He's not lying. There's no way he can lie. I'm using the powers of Glory Crown." Colin nodded his head and said, "In this state he doesn't show any traces of evil, degeneration, or corruption. Discovering these traits was a special ability of a demon hunter. As a high-sequence job, demon hunters were the best at concealing their movements and intentions, making it impossible for them to be detected by targets who could foretell danger. Therefore, every demon hunter was a devil's nemesis. After some thought, Colin got up and left the room. He said to the shadow in the corner outside, "I'll release Derek later. I think he's fine for the time being. However, secretly monitor him for a while. If Amon is able to produce 2 avatars, he might be able to create a third." "Yes, Chief," the shadow responded respectfully. After Derek woke up, the interrogation chamber was empty, with only words informing him that he was free to leave. He secretly heaved a sigh of relief as he began walking out. While doing so, he thought of Mr. Hangman's advice. You can't relax just like that and end up careless. The secret surveillance will definitely continue for some time. Otherwise, your chief is lacking. Yes, I can't even recite the honorific name of Mr. Fool anymore for the time being. Derek muttered to himself as he walked down the spiral staircase. As he was walking, he suddenly saw a familiar figure dressed in a purple-striped black robe. It was the beautiful shepherd elder Lovia. Her pale gray eyes swept over Derek, and a gentle smile appeared on her face. Back in her room, with an indifferent expression, Lovia walked to the desk and unfolded a piece of parchment that was made from leather. Her left hand pinched the index finger of her right hand and snapped the tip of her finger. However, not a single drop of blood dripped. It was as if her blood had been gathered onto the surface of her finger. With this finger, she drew a complex symbol on the piece of paper. It was made up of a pupilless eye which represented secrecy and the contorted lines which represented change. After careful examination, she wrapped the finger with this piece of paper, stuffed it into her mouth, and bit on it noisily before swallowing it all. With only 4 fingers left, flesh and blood suddenly squirmed around the wound on her right palm. It quickly grew into a new index finger, one that looked slightly pale. She lowered her head, looked at her palm, and whispered a phrase, "The Fool." Chapter 401. Divine Epiphany Backlund. In a basement that resembled a temple. Mr. Ich, dressed in a hooded black robe, motionlessly quietly knelt in front of a figurine of the hanged giant for an extended period of time. Suddenly, he pricked up his ears as if he was listening to something. After a short pause, Mr. A's hands jerked up, and he snapped his right index finger with his left palm. He stuffed the bloody finger into his mouth and munched on it like he was eating snacks, making crunching sounds. Gulp. Mr. A's throat wiggled, and he swallowed his gnawed fingers into his stomach. His body suddenly trembled, as if he was being grabbed and shaken by an invisible figure. In this state, Mr. A stretched out his right hand and used the blood from his wound to write words on the ground. Those words were written in neither Jotun or Dragonese, which could stir the powers of nature, nor was it in Hermes, which was used for sacrificial rituals. Instead, they were written in the most ordinary and commonplace language, Loan. The scarlet color quickly gathered together and the words pieced together into a few sentences. Found, the fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Adorers and devotees in Backlund. After the end of the divine epiphany, Mr. A stopped trembling, and a new finger grew out of his squirming wound. He lowered his head and carefully read the words he had just written, the corners of his mouth curled up in the shadows. By your divine revelation. Mr. A humbly prostrated as though he had found the meaning of his existence once again. City of Silver at the top of the spire. Lovia walked to the window and looked down at the candlelight in the darkness, her expression softening. After an unknown period of time, she heard a knock at the door. Your Excellency? Lovia turned around with alacrity and greeted the visitor with a smile. The door opened backward automatically. The person standing outside was none other than demon hunter Colin Iliad. He was draped with a brown coat and a leather belt with secret compartments around his waist. Lovia, the abnormality of the exploratory team has been verified, Colin described plainly. As captain, regardless of your condition, you have to stay in the dungeon for 3 days and undergo the Glory Crown's cleansing. You should know that this is the rule. Lovia didn't show the slightest hint of anger as she calmly smiled. I know, I've already made preparations to stay in the dungeon for a long time. When it's over, I can accept any arrangements even if you guys still don't trust me. As she spoke, she had walked to the door and went past Demon Hunter Colin while facing him. Colin turned silently and followed her down the winding steps. Halfway there, they heard heart-wrenching cries and shouts. Is it starting again? Lovia asked with a slightly confused expression. Colin nodded and replied in a low voice. Yes, this is a destiny that we can't escape from. At this moment, in a large hall in the middle levels of the spire, the members of the exploratory team and the few residents of the City of Silver who had been corrupted were pressed down to the ground by seemingly corporeal holy lusters. They were unable to move, as though they were carrying a huge mountain on their backs. A couple in their 40s with dark skin held a sword with complicated patterns as they walked up to a young man in his early 20s. The young man's body had already turned into a meat slush, but his head was still intact. Only a long, thin, blood-red tendril grew out of it. Seeing the couple approaching, he shouted in horror, Dad, Mom, what are you doing? Didn't we agree to eat grilled iron scorpions together tonight? Dad, Mom, I caught a lot of iron scorpions for you. The couple couldn't bear it any longer and turned their heads to the side, but they raised the sword in their hands high into the air. After 2 stabbing sounds rang out, the young man stopped his wailing. He twitched first, then he completely lost all signs of life. Elsewhere, a young girl who was around 10 years old raised a sword with complicated patterns on it. Tears were streaming down her face as she stabbed her elder sister. The girl lying on the ground suddenly laughed and gently said, From today onwards, you'll have to live your own life. Don't be naive anymore. The girl immediately cried until her vision turned into a blur, and the sword in her hand stopped in midair. However, a strong palm pressed the back of her hand, pushing it forward. The girl was left stunned, as though she couldn't hear or see anything. This was the ancient curse that everyone in the City of Silver was under. They had to kill their own blood relatives to prevent them from turning into terrifying and strange evil spirits after their deaths. Therefore, even though Dark had completely mutated into a monster and was corrupted by an unknown existence, having no value in interrogating, the Shadow Observer didn't dare to kill him on the spot. Instead, he tried his best to restrain the monster and bring it back to the spire to wait for his parents. Otherwise, the situation would only become worse. The exploratory team members were currently receiving the same treatment that they had been subjected to, a process that remained unchanging for more than 2,000 years. Although no one knew if they would mutate after dying in this state, no one dared to gamble on it. Fortunately, the City of Silver didn't have a large population, and all of them lived in the same area. Under the arrangements of the upper echelons for each generation, there were quite a few people who were related to each other by blood. Even if they were limited by 3 generations, they would still be able to find quite a few. Because of this, the Beyonder in charge of setting up a patrol team would first have to consider the matter of blood ties in order to prevent any unexpected situations from occurring. The requirements for exploratory teams weren't that strict because their missions were always to invade deep into the darkness and stay far away from the City of Silver. Even if they died or mutated, it wouldn't affect everyone's safety. Once a resident no longer had blood relatives within 3 generations, they would be placed under strict surveillance, and as soon as he became seriously ill or visibly aged, he would be exiled into the depths of darkness, away from the City of Silver. When the previous captain of the exploratory team, Uddle, was isolated in the dungeon, there were actually 3 elders in the spire. However, the one who took action was Chief Colin Iliad in the end. Otherwise, they could only attempt to seal. This was because Uddle was the elder brother of his direct kin. Shepherd Lovia and Demon Hunter Collins silently entered the bottom level of the spire. Accompanied by a few Dawn Paladins, they arrived at the depths of the dungeon. Soon, both of them stopped outside a cell. The Dawn Paladins dispersed themselves a distance away. Without any abnormalities, she walked into a room with a single bed, a table, and a single candle at a moderate pace. Before the metal door closed, she turned around and looked at Demon Hunter Colin with her pale gray eyes. Your Excellency, you once told me that when residents of the City of Silver leave this place and die in the depths of the darkness, they won't immediately turn into evil spirits. A few days have to pass. Therefore, the other members of the exploratory team have plenty of time to pull open a distance from them. Colin nodded and expressed his agreement. Lovia closed her eyes, revealing a sad smile. In an exploration 2 months ago, a team member died in front of me. I pretended to be separated from the rest of the team. I waited there for 5 days, but he didn't turn into an evil spirit. Demon Hunter Colin looked at her in silence, not saying anything until the metal door closed with a clang and the seal took shape. In the ancient palace above the fog. After waiting for a while, Klein was finally relieved when he saw that there were no changes to the crimson star which symbolized Little Sunday. He should have succeeded. He rubbed his temples, wrapped his spirituality around his body, and descended back to the real world. As soon as he felt the presence of his body, Klein experienced the bitter cold. He sneezed, then he quickly removed the wall of spirituality and crawled back into bed. Sadly, his bed was already ice cold. Fortunately, my body receives a certain degree of protection after entering the gray fog. Otherwise, I would probably catch a cold tomorrow. Klein wrapped himself tightly with his blanket and sighed. The current state he was in reminded him of a joke he had heard in his previous life. Warmth is basically gained by vibration. Before his bed warmed up again, he could only let his mind wander as he thought about all sorts of matters. Yes, there are no pressing matters for me recently. The magician's rules have been concluded. Even if I don't challenge the impossible and only engage in acting normally, I should be able to digest the potions around New Year's. My next task is to collect the Beyonder ingredients for the Faceless Potion and save up the necessary funds. But that's not something I can rush. The taut strings in Klein's mind gradually softened, and he suddenly had the thought of resting for 2 to 3 days. As the bed warmed, he fell asleep without realizing it. When he woke up, he heard the church bells ringing 8 times. Klein stretched out his arm, felt the cold, and silently withdrew it. It seems to have turned colder again today. Since there's nothing pertinent to do, it seems I can just continue sleeping in. Relaxed, he closed his eyes again. But after a while, he heard his stomach growling and felt the bulge in his lower abdomen. Life is full of hard choices. Klein mumbled. After 10 minutes or so of struggling between the two feelings, he finally gave up, got up, and rushed to the bathroom next door. After changing his clothes and washing up, he went down to the first floor and took out some ingredients to cook Potter noodles. This time, he didn't intend to use the meat sauce that he bought, but instead, he wanted to try the meat paste he had made 2 days ago. This was the meat paste he had carefully chosen from the ingredients based on his memories. Although there were ultimately differences in the ingredients between the two worlds, preventing him from fully replicating the authentic taste, Klein still found it pretty good after sampling it. It wasn't long before he had a bowl of Potter noodles with condiments and meat paste. He found it a really wonderful morning. Keeping in with the tradition of this world, he browsed through the newspapers as he ate, and he checked if Eye of Wisdom had placed an advertisement first. Based on his late-night thoughts from yesterday, Klein decided to have some fun today, so he considered whether he should go to a concert, an opera, or a play. The tickets to many of the music halls in the West Borough, Hillston Borough, and Sherwood Borough are at least 6 solely, and if it's a famous musician, then they would even be on the order of pounds. Music halls specially catered to common folk range from 6 to 9 pence. Those that are open to the poor with money to spare in East Borough only need 1 pence. Klein flipped through the relevant materials to select his choice of entertainment for the day. At that moment, he heard the doorbell ring. Ding dong. Chapter 402, Digging Who Is It? Klein jerked his head up to look at the door. He felt as if he were suffering from an illness. The fear of hearing the doorbell ring was identical to the symptoms he had experienced on Earth, being afraid of his cell phone's ringing. Putting down the newspaper and magazine, he looked at the empty plate which had been cleaned even of its seasonings. Then he stood up, and he walked to the door. Before he got a hold of the handle, he already knew that it was Dr. Aaron outside. "Don't you need to work?" Klein mumbled as he opened the door. "Good morning, Aaron. The fog is gray today." He smiled. Aaron was still wearing his cold expression, but there was an additional sense of anxiety and fear written on his face. He nudged his gold-rimmed spectacles and, without bothering to greet him, bluntly said, "Sherlock, I had another dream. I dreamed of Will Ossepton again." Klein almost froze. "That's not right? The real paper crane is with me, above the gray fog, while the one I folded is with the Nighthawks. You're still able to dream of Will Ossepton with a paper crane which was poorly folded by a Nighthawk? That's not scientific. No, that's not mystic." Klein became serious and asked, "The same dream?" "No, it's not that scary this time." Aaron became a little calmer. "I dreamed about the grim cemetery. You know of it, right?" "Yes," Klein answered simply. Back then, he had caught a group of students and a mysticism enthusiast who was a complete beginner, Kapusky, engaging in a spiritual dance outside Grim Cemetery. He later received another copper whistle from the latter which could be used to summon a messenger. Aaron drew a deep breath of cold air and continued, "I dreamed of the woods outside Grim Cemetery. I dreamed of a birch tree which had a layer of bark peeled off its trunk. Will Ossepton was sitting underneath that tree, looking at me quietly. And then?" Klein pressed. Aaron shook his head. "The dream ended there." "What a strange matter. Has Dr. Aaron's dream got nothing to do with the paper crane?" "No, if it wasn't related, then there wouldn't have been a situation where the dream changed after the paper crane was switched. Furthermore, I also performed a divination using the paper crane above the gray fog and obtained the corresponding revelations." Klein said in a measured voice, "This is no longer within my scope of understanding. What do you want from me, Aaron?" Aaron breathed out warm air that dispersed into white mist. "I want to pay a visit to the area outside Grim Cemetery. I want to do it now, while it's still daytime. Can you protect me? I'll pay you £1. Heading over to the place that appeared in the dream now? He probably wouldn't encounter anything too strange during the day. Klein thought for a moment and said, "I can accept this request, but I suggest that you go back to the same cathedral and tell your dream to the bishop you're familiar with." Aaron agreed, then said doubtfully, "Why do you always suggest that I go to the cathedral? I know, you've explained it before in a very logical way, that if mystical powers exist in this world, then the churches, which have been leading humanity, must be the ones with the strongest mystical powers, and if there are none, then at least we can go to the church to get psychological comfort and corresponding connections. However, why do you suggest that I go to the cathedral for something that isn't considered too strange?" Klein considered for 2 seconds, then replied seriously, "I'm a detective. I've come into contact with a lot of unusual things, so I understand the special nature of the church. I also know when to ask for help." "Really?" Aaron listened with a serious expression. The corners of Klein's mouth curled up. "Just kidding. Take it easy, Aaron. I'm going to change my clothes first. And also do the dishes." Having chatted with Aaron at the door for a long time without his thick coat, he turned rather stiff from the cold winds. Taking this opportunity, Klein went to the washroom, went above the gray fog, and divined the degree of danger for this mission. He received the answer that there was almost no risk. If he received a revelation indicating that it was dangerous, his plan was to reject the mission using the Church of the Evernight Goddess as an excuse. Hillston Borough, Myriad Star Cathedral. "Sherlock, why don't you hire a maid? As a great detective, you can afford to have several servants," Aaron asked, as he led Klein to the Church of the Evernight Goddess's largest cathedral in Hillston Borough. This was something that he had wanted to ask while in the carriage, but he had never found the opportunity to change the subject. Klein sighed and said heavily, "Aaron, let me tell you a story. There was a detective who hired 2 maids, a cook, and an assistant, and he was doing pretty well, but one day he took over a case and successfully homed in on the murderer, who was a very savage and cruel man. He sneaked into the detective's house with the intention of revenge. The detective was a fighting expert, and in the end he was only slightly injured, but 2 of his servants died because of him. Do you get it, Aaron?" "I see." Aaron's voice had a hint of empathy. "Sherlock, I never knew that you've had such an experience." "No, the main character has nothing to do with me. I just made up a story. It's not like I can tell you directly that I'm involved in many strange and mystical matters, and that there will always be unspeakable secrets in my house, so that it's best I don't hire any servants. Klein looked forward and let out a long sigh. The cleaning of his home was done twice a week, mostly by Mrs. Stellensammer's maid. She was responsible for the most basic cleaning procedures, and each cleaning cost 1 soldi. While they were talking, the two of them had already entered the hall of the Myriad Star Cathedral. It was dark, quiet, and devoid of candles, completely in line with the Church of the Evernight Goddess's style. At the very front of the hall was an altar engraved with a dark sacred emblem. The stars were inlaid with self-illuminating pearls, and the crimson moon was made of rubies. The rest of the hall was filled with the darkness of the night. With a single glance, he could see that the place was filled with specks of light as the crimson light illuminated the area, making the place extremely sacred. But Klein felt that this was inferior to the design used by St. Selina Cathedral in Tingen. That hall was pitch black, with only light penetrating from the front through the fist-sized holes. It resembled a star sky, making one feel awe from the bottom of one's heart. However, there's a problem with that kind of design. At night, the effect would be gone. Klein took a seat at random, took off his half-top hat and leaned on his black hardwood cane, while Aaron continued down the aisle to the confessional in search of the bishop. Sitting in such a large hall and looking at the people who were concentrating on praying, Klein's heart suddenly became tranquil. Come to think of it, this is only my 3rd time entering the goddess's cathedral. He let out a self-deprecating laugh. Inside the Cathedral of Serenity at Winter County, Leonard Mitchell put on his black windbreaker and red gloves and entered the room of the high-ranking deacon, Crestet Sesamir. Congratulations, you have officially become a red glove. May the goddess bless you. Sesamir drew a crimson moon on his chest. He still had his mouth covered with his high collar. Praise the lady. The honor is mine. Leonard raised his right hand and gestured 4 points in a clockwise fashion. Sesamir didn't say anything else and went straight to the point. According to your request, I've placed you in Soa's team. He's a soul assurer and possesses a mystical item. I've already ordered someone to prepare a beyonder weapon for you that you'll need. Your team will be in charge of a devil summoning case, and you'll take into consideration certain clues to perform the search. For example, cases that have happened consecutively in Backlund and matters related to a tarot ritual. Yes, Reverend Sesamir. Leonard held no objections towards the mission. This will be the beginning of my revenge, he silently said to himself. West Borough, in the periphery of Grimm Cemetery. Klein accompanied Dr. Aaron as they took quite a while to walk around the nearby woods, coughing from time to time as a result of the falling grayish-white dust. Maybe there isn't a tree like that. Dreams can't fully reflect reality. Towards the end of the search, even Aaron was feeling a little uncertain himself. Fortunately, I'm good at finding things. Klein pointed with his cane and said, let's take a look over there and make it our final effort. All right. Aaron gasped for a breath of air. After a short walk, Aaron suddenly stopped and said, while pointing diagonally ahead, over there, over there. About a dozen meters away, a birch tree with a strip of bark around its trunk stripped off stood there quietly, as if it were waiting for them. It's identical to the one in my dream, Aaron said with conviction. Klein smiled and said with some vigilance, but there's no Willow Septon. Aaron got close to the birch tree, frowned for a while, then he suddenly pointed to the side of the tree and said, back then, Willow Septon was sitting here, and he was pointing at the mud below him with his finger. Pointing at the mud below him? Klein stood at the side, looking down at the almost unwithered grass. You want to dig it up? Aaron nodded. We've already found this place, so we should confirm what's here. Sherlock, go to the cemetery and borrow 2 shovels. It's better if I stay here. You go to the cemetery, I'm worried something might happen to you, Klein said cautiously. All right. Aaron didn't refuse, and he immediately left the forest. After a while, after offering some money, he returned with 3 shovels and a tombkeeper, and they began to dig. While Klein was digging, he suddenly smelled something familiar. As the soil on the surface parted, the things below were gradually exposed. It was the body of a child that was already greatly rotten. His skin and flesh looked as if they were about to melt, and many bugs crawled in and out of his nose and mouth. Clang! The shovel fell from Aaron's hand and hit a rock. He pointed to the legs of the corpse, his mouth moving frantically, but he was unable to say a word. Klein endured the nausea and looked closely, discovering that the child's left leg was obviously missing its lower half. At the same time, Aaron took 2 steps back and fell to the ground, shouting sharply, "Wiloseptin! Wiloseptin!" It was Wiloseptin's corpse. Chapter 403. The Fate of a Private Detective. He's dead? Wiloseptin is dead? And he seems to have been dead for some time. Could this be fake? Klein looked at the body of the child in surprise and suspicion as many thoughts bubbled in his mind. From what he knew, Wiloseptin was a special child who could be involved with a sequence, one of the monster pathway, Snake of Mercury, in some way. In the divination game he played, a casual, "Doctor, your luck will get worse," was enough to make Aaron suffer from bad luck for an extended period of time. The paper crane he folded allowed Aaron's astral projection to be located in the spirit world and be instilled with artificial revelations. Even above the gray fog, Klein only received an inkling of his location and couldn't come to an effective conclusion. How could such a child die for no reason? He was dead before Dr. Aaron's dreams? What about his family? Klein narrowed his eyes, and despite his intense nausea, he carefully examined the highly rotten body. He noticed some torn tarot cards in the surrounding soil. His spiritual intuition told him that the corpse in front of him was most likely Wiloseptin. It's really shocking and difficult to understand. I should go above the gray fog later and confirm if it's a fake death from Wiloseptin. Wait, what does this have to do with me? I had already decided not to get involved in this matter any further, in case I get entangled by some Snake of Mercury. This might be even more terrifying than sealed artifact 0-08. Klein snapped out of his daze and said to the terrified tomb keeper and Dr. Aaron, who was on the verge of a mental breakdown, "Call the police." "Okay, but..." The tomb keeper was taken aback at first before he repeated his reply. With the shovel in hand, he turned and ran out of the woods, at a speed that was so fast that it appeared as though he was being chased by a zombie. As expected, he's just an ordinary person and isn't cautious at all. In this kind of situation, shouldn't he be wary of the people around him who might have malicious intent? By exposing your back, it would be easy for you to be hit by a shovel. Klein glanced at the back of the tomb keeper and shook his head with a sigh. When he was a Nighthawk in Tingen, he had read a lot of case files and found out that many of the victims had ended up becoming victims of their companions. Thinking of this, Klein walked to Dr. Aaron, bent down, and stretched out his hand. "There's nothing to be afraid of. He's already dead." "It's the death that scares me." Aaron calmed down a bit, and without accepting Klein's help, he got up by himself. His black frock coat was covered with dirt, and Klein felt his heart pain for the clothes for some baffling reason. "I'm the kind of person who can't stand seeing anything valuable get damaged." He inwardly sighed with emotion. Noticing that Aaron was still panicking, Klein laughed and said, "At such times, praying to the deity you believe in has quite a remarkable effect." "Is that so?" Aaron was stunned. He tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise manner and chanted softly, "The Evernight Goddess is nobler than the stars and more eternal than eternity. Your devout believer prays for your blessing." After repeating this over and over again, he gradually calmed down, no longer feeling as terrified as before. Klein drew a triangular sacred emblem on his chest and silently whispered to himself, "God of steam and machinery, your completely unfaithful believer is begging for your blessings." As he spoke, he couldn't help but laugh at himself, suspecting that he might be smote to death by lightning on the spot. However, lightning and thunder belong to the Lord of Storms, and it isn't in the domain of the God of steam and machinery. Klein thought in a relaxed manner. After about 20 minutes, the two of them found themselves sitting in an interrogation room at a nearby police station. During the testimony, Klein frankly informed the police that he was a private investigator who wasn't too sure of what was happening. As for Dr. Aaron, he described his dream in detail as the reason for digging to find the body. Klein could tell that the police didn't believe him at all, but after they had gone out for a while, they immediately changed their attitudes, saying that there was nothing suspicious about Dr. Aaron and Detective Moriarty. All they had to do was sign their statements and leave. Aaron was surprised, but Klein wasn't surprised. It was obvious that the Nighthawks had been involved. The advantage of having the doctor head to the Myriad Star Cathedral in advance was demonstrated. Before leaving the police station, Klein wasn't surprised to see a familiar figure. It was the Nighthawk who had entered his dream earlier. The man on duty, who was probably a captain, was still wearing a gray windbreaker and was obviously more resistant to the cold than Klein. His blue eyes swept past Klein's face without any signs of abnormality, pretending to be an ordinary senior inspector. Klein, who was also pretending to be an ordinary private detective, nudged his glasses, put on half-top hat, and left the station with Dr. Aaron in a carriage. After instructing his carriage driver to head to Minsk Street first, Aaron turned to Klein and said, "Sherlock, do you think this will be the end of it? If that body really belongs to Will Ossepton, then you shouldn't be troubled any longer." Klein paused and continued, "Aaron, have you found anything else that's strange during this period of time? Regardless of what it is." Aaron thought about it and shook his head. "No. This is worth celebrating." Klein sighed and said with a smile. To him, this was the best way things could end with Will Ossepton's matter. Although the paper crane Klein had folded above the gray fog wouldn't reveal anything, and there would be no problems with any divination afterward, he was still a little worried that some Nighthawk would suddenly think of something and use it to find some clues. And now, with the death of Will Ossepton, the case might soon reach a dead end, put in the archives, and temporarily declared a closed case. No one would pay any more attention to it without any new developments. Aaron relaxed and asked suspiciously, "Frankly, I don't think my statement was very convincing. Why did the cops choose to believe it in the end?" "I don't know either," Klein feigned puzzlement and said, "I thought I'd have to get my lawyer to take me home again. No, bail me out." Aaron smirked and said, "Sherlock, you seem to have a lot of experience in being sent to the police station?" Klein laughed and replied in a deep voice, "It's the fate of every private detective." Just as Klein and Aaron were being taken to the police station near Grimm Cemetery, Furs Wall was wearing a long black dress and a black bonnet with a fine mesh hanging down. She entered the silent cemetery and found the grave of Mrs. Alisa. She and Zio had gone to Empress Borough an hour ago to visit Viscount Glaint, and they had successfully gotten a verbal agreement for borrowing £400 without any interest. Viscount Glaint's only request was that the two Beyonders accompany him to the gathering Mr. A would convene tonight to ensure his safety. He was anxious to procure a royal jellyfish's venom crystal so that he could complete the concoction of the apothecary potion. Audrey had found the horn of an adult flying unicorn in the family treasury, and she had taken one out in the name of doing a biological experiment, effectively offsetting part of her debt. She also put forward an additional condition for Viscount Glaint to get the help of Duke Negan's children to confirm if the dragon specimens in the treasury had a thousand-faced hunter and whether there were still light dots flashing inside. When the loan was settled, Furs was in no hurry to pray to Mr. Fool to close the deal as quickly as possible, because it would make Zio intuitively turn suspicious if things developed too quickly. Taking advantage of her free time, she changed her clothes and rented a horse carriage to get to Grimm Cemetery, which was located on the outskirts of West Borough. Knowing the law of Beyonder characteristics conservation and indestructibility, Furs realized that the main ingredient that turned her into an apprentice was the Beyonder characteristic left behind by Mrs. Alisa. In a way, she had inherited her powers. Therefore, she couldn't help but pay a visit and put a bouquet of flowers in front of Mrs. Alisa's grave and thank her. It was early winter, and most of the flowers had long since withered, but Furs still bought a handful of plain flowers. These flowers were grown in a greenhouse and were quite expensive. "Thank you, Emperor Roselle, for your invention," Furs said inwardly in a most sincere manner. As far as she knew, most of the flowers that the nobles used for their winter banquets came from greenhouses, while a tiny portion was delivered directly from the warm south by airships. This was more than the average middle-class worker could bear. Standing in front of the black tombstone, Furs took a deep look at the photograph of Mrs. Alisa before bending down to lay down the flowers and whispered, "Thank you." She immediately straightened up, closed her eyes, and quietly recalled the past. At this moment, she heard a slightly aged voice. You really are a good and kind-hearted lady. Furs opened her eyes and turned her head, realizing that Mr. Lawrence, from the Abraham family, had also appeared there at some point. He was also holding a bouquet of plain but elegant flowers in his hand. No, this is not goodness, nor is it kindness. Mrs. Alisa once gave me, a person who had lost her mother, an unforgettable period of warmth, Furs said sincerely. Her eyes were suddenly moist. Lawrence, who only had wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, put down the flowers and sighed. This shows that you value relationships. After chatting for a while, when Furs was about to leave, Lawrence, who was waving her goodbye, suddenly began to cough violently. Cough, cough, cough. He coughed until his legs buckled and fell to the ground. It seemed as if he would die at any moment from suffocation. As a doctor who had graduated from an accredited school, Furs didn't hesitate to turn around, crouch down, and begin performing first aid. After a while, Lawrence's condition finally stabilized. He wiped the saliva from the corner of his mouth and smiled at Furs. "Lady, can you take me back to the hotel?" "No problem." Furs helped him to his feet. Lawrence looked ahead, his eyes a little out of focus. He coughed lightly, and he said with a sad and self-deprecating laugh, "My life might be coming to an end." Chapter 404. In Trust West Borough, Calpensa Hotel. Furs helped Lawrence into his room and laid him down on the bed. It was a rather luxurious hotel, with thick, soft, grayish-yellow carpets everywhere except the washroom. On the walls hung imitations of famous oil paintings. Lawrence gasped for air and said, "Thank you, Miss Wall, and please forgive a dying man for not being able to bow." "No, Mr. Lawrence, your problem has eased. As a former medical doctor, I can tell you without a doubt that you can still live. After some rest, we'll go to a clinic or a hospital," Furs consoled him. Lawrence smiled. "I know my physical condition very well. You don't have to comfort me. Besides, I'm an amateur astrologer. I already had a premonition that I'm going to die in this hotel in Backland." Aside from some superficial concealment, everything he said was the truth. He was already close to 80, and he was no longer that robust and spirited young man from before. If not for the sequence potions that elevated his constitution, he might have already been buried in some random cemetery. Originally, Lawrence thought he could live for another 10 years, but who would have thought that he would encounter a rebellion caused by the former traveler Bodis? He suffered relatively serious injuries at the hands of the Aurora Order, and his remaining descendants all died in that disaster. This dealt him a great blow, and he almost didn't manage to recover from it. The search for his brothers and their descendants in Backland had only resulted in him receiving news of their deaths, dealing him a significant blow to his mental well-being once more. Compounded by all these things, Lawrence clearly felt that his life had come to an end. His initial plan was to return to the graves of Labero and Alisa again and present a bouquet of flowers. He would then return immediately and meet with the other members of the Elder Council to set things in order before his death, but being an elderly man, his condition was beyond his control. Without waiting for a response from Furs, Lawrence struggled to retrieve a palm-sized notebook from the inside pocket of his half-open coat. The hard paper cover of the notebook was bronze green, giving off a very ancient feeling. On its surface, the words, "I came, I saw, I record," was written in ancient Fasak. Lawrence placed the notebook on the quilt in front of his chest and took a deep breath. "Mississippi Wall, if I die here, can you help me send it to Pritz Harbor?" "Mr. Lawrence, you'll be fine," Furs emphasized. At the same time, she subconsciously glanced at the notebook and found that it wasn't thick at all. There were a total of 3 types of papers inside, one of which was a yellow type of parchment which had very few pages. The other was yellowish-brown goatskin, and the number of pages was in the middle of the range. The last was comprised of ordinary white paper and was the most common. Lawrence laughingly said with great difficulty, "I mean, Mississippi Wall, will you help? Pritz Harbor isn't far. It's not even a trip. If it needs to be rushed, then I can even make the round trip in half a day by taking the steam locomotive." Furs nodded. Lawrence breathed a sigh of relief as his mind seemed to recover a little. "After I die, wait 10 minutes. Retrieve the glowing object from my body, and then send it along with this notebook to Dorian Gray at the Pritz Harbor's Fishermen Association. The 42 pounds in cash in my wallet will be the reward and my gratitude. As for these clothes of mine, let it turn to ash along with me. No, you don't need to give me anything. No, you'll be fine, Mr. Lawrence, Furs said earnestly. As if he hadn't heard her, Lawrence whispered to himself, maybe Dorian will give you additional rewards, but it depends on you. I believe you. From Elisa's matter, I can tell that you're a good girl. He suddenly seemed to turn lucid as he said to Furs, Ms. Wall, can you go down to the first floor and bring me a jug of water? I don't know when the waiter will come over. No problem. Without thinking, Furs took a water jug and walked out of the room. After walking a few steps, she suddenly felt that something was amiss. The water jug in her hand was heavy, and there was obviously a lot of water in it. Just as she was about to turn around and ask, she suddenly sensed a strong fluctuation of spirituality in the room. For a moment Furs froze, and then she understood what Mr. Lawrence was trying to do. As death approached, he could clearly sense that something was wrong with his body. He was afraid of losing control and turning into a monster. He wanted to die as a human, not a monster, so he chose to end his own life. That was the last form of decency for a Beyonder. Of course, if he had turned into a monster, all his plans would have come to naught. With this in mind, Furs became dejected. She waited outside for nearly 10 minutes before she pushed open the door and entered. She saw Lawrence lying silently on the bed, looking like he had aged considerably. Beside him was a diamond, the size of an eye. The light which shone in through the window was constantly refracted by the diamond, forming a scene as beautiful as the radiance of the stars. Furs sighed and performed a careful examination. She found that the cause of Lawrence's death was the most ordinary form of cardiac arrest. Chowood Borough, 15 Minsk Street. Klein rested for a while after getting home. He then went above the gray fog, having plans to divine the situation with Will Ossepton. He had the paper crane fly out of the trash pile in the corner and made it land on the long bronze table in front of him. Then, he took out the topaz pendant that was wrapped around his sleeve. As he held the spirit pendulum in his left hand, Klein used cogitation to adjust his condition before recalling the scenes he had seen in the woods outside the cemetery. He might not have noticed some of the details, but it was certain that his spirituality wouldn't miss any. This divination was mainly about using this point and relying on the gray fog to eliminate all distractions. After finishing his preparations, Klein took out a goatskin parchment and wrote the divination statement, Will Ossepton is completely dead. Then, he pressed the paper crane next to the divination sentence, almost causing the topaz pendant to touch the words. After entering a state of cogitation and completing all the steps of the spirit dowsing, Klein opened his eyes and looked at the result. The topaz pendant was rotating counterclockwise at a fast frequency and high amplitude. It was a negative result. That meant that Will Ossepton wasn't completely dead. Klein was surprised, but it seemed to be within his expectations. He thought for a moment, then he changed the divination statement. That corpse was Will Ossepton's. This time, the spirit pendulum gave a positive result. The body did belong to Will Ossepton. An idea came to Klein's mind, and he wrote a new divination statement. Will Ossepton's corpse will resurrect. After a few moments of calmly performing the divination, Klein saw the revelation. The pendulum was rotating counterclockwise with a fast frequency. That meant that Will Ossepton's corpse wouldn't be resurrected, or in other words, no reanimations. It looks like Will Ossepton had voluntarily or was forced to abandon his previous body, and he is surviving in another way. This matter has something to do with the snake of Mercury? Klein tried to divine additional information, but he failed repeatedly, including the statement, Will Ossepton's present state. However, he repeated the divination using dream divination and inquired, Will Ossepton's current location? He received a similar scene, a dark room with the sound of running water. However, the feeling it gave him seemed to be a little different. Forget it, there's no need to waste any more time on this. I'm not planning to get involved anyway. Klein put away his spirit pendulum and prepared to return to the real world. Through the prior divination and everything that had happened before, he had a theory about Will Ossepton, but he couldn't confirm it. He suspected that Will was another snake of Mercury. As a sequence 1, a snake of Mercury wasn't the only one. There could be up to 3 in existence at the same time. The snake of fate, who wielded destiny naturally, could locate Aaron's astral projection through the paper crane and show him a false revelation. Without a doubt, it also had the ability to change a person's fate. For some reason, Will had become weak and was under the threat of the second snake of Mercury. Everything he did was to escape his counterpart. As for the reason for their conflict, the answer was simple. Without a sequence 0, there could be 3 sequence 1s at the same time, but once there was a sequence 0, there would be no sequence 1s. Regarding this sentence, the formula of the Dark Emperor potion clearly stated the truth. One of the main ingredients of the recipe was 2 Beyonder characteristics of a Prince of Disorder. Prince of Disorder was sequence 1 of the Dark Emperor pathway. As a sequence 1, if one wanted to advance to sequence 0, then one had to obtain all the Beyonder characteristics of the other 2 sequence 1s of the same pathway. With this guess in mind, Klein was increasingly afraid of getting involved with Will case. If my deduction is correct, it would be a genuine fight between deities, and I can't afford to get myself involved. Klein's spirituality descended, and he disappeared from the ancient palace above the gray fog. In Empress Burrow, in an inconspicuous house, the Beyonder gathering organized by Mr. A proceeded as scheduled. Furs and Zio had changed their clothes, and they accompanied Viscount Glaint, who was wearing an iron-black mask, into the hall. They randomly chose a seat and sat down. Viscount Glaint wrote down his needs to the attendants before the gathering officially began. He also prayed to the goddess that there would be a response later. As usual, Furs maintained her usual languidness and, in a rare instance, covered herself with a hood, concealing her face with the shadows. She was thinking about the situation with Mr. Lawrence. She knew very clearly what that diamond, the size of an eye, was. It was a Beyonder characteristic left behind by him. However, for the time being, she was unable to confirm what sequence it belonged to. Furs had casually flipped through the notebook, only to find that many of the pages were still blank. The written content was filled with all sorts of strange, odd, and mysterious symbols and magic labels, exceeding whatever she knew. What it is isn't important. What's important is that I keep my promise, Furs warned herself. At this moment, Mr. A, who was seated on a single sofa and was wearing an exaggerated hood, said hoarsely, "I have a mission. Help me find people who believe in the so-called fool." Furs instantly snapped back to her senses. Chapter 405, Cult, the Fool. The Beyonders who attended Mr. A's gathering either ruminated over the phrase or conversed with their companions to discuss whether they had ever met anyone who had a similar faith. "When did such a cult appear?" someone asked in a low voice. At this point, Mr. A made the attendant beside him hold up a blackboard with a few lines of words written in the loan language. "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck." As the attendees examined the blackboard, Mr. A said in a hoarse and jarring voice, "Do not use Hermes to read what's written here. Even more so for Jotun, Elvish, Dragonese, and Ancient Hermes. You shouldn't even write the corresponding descriptions, otherwise, there is a high probability that something terrible will happen. Help me find believers in the fool. Of course, they might also be followers of the mysterious ruler above the gray fog or the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. As long as there's a clue, inform me immediately. The reward I'll provide will be so handsome that it will far exceed your imagination." This description? It sounds like an incredible existence. I've only seen similar descriptions in the ancient texts of the 7 gods. A gathering member exclaimed. His companion shook his head and said, "The beings which many cults believe in have similar descriptions." "Is it really a cult?" The other gathering members were stunned when they heard their discussion. "Likely. Typically, when we summon a creature from the spirit world, we might have 3 lines describing it, but one of the lines would be about the blessed one of someone, or that who belongs to. It wouldn't be in this format." A gathering member who was well-versed in mysticism gave an explanation. As they vehemently conversed, Furs was nearly dumbfounded. Isn't that the honorific name of Mr. Fool? Even though it's described in the loan language, I'm sure of it. Why would Mr. A want to find the believers of Mr. Fool? Is the Aurora Order behind this? Furs's mind was in a mess. She knew that Mr. A was a member of the Aurora Order because of a particular terrorist organization had announced its responsibility in the assassination of Intis Ambassador Bakerland. After a brief moment of astonishment, Furs subconsciously began to examine herself, afraid that someone would discover that she was already a member of the Tarot Club and that, in some sense, she was an adorer of the Fool. I just recited the honorific name of the Fool according to the ancient Hermes on that piece of paper and was pulled above the gray fog. No one knows about this, and I don't have to be afraid of being investigated. But there's a link to that piece of paper with Mr. Fool's honorific name written on it. It was hidden in a book we borrowed from the Viscount Glaint. Thoughts rapidly flashed through Furs's mind. The Fool that doesn't belong to this era? Isn't that the description I saw on that piece of paper? I even dreamed of an evil spirit. At the same time, Zio remembered the incident that had frightened her, but her long experience as a bounty hunter had kept her from revealing anything unusual. And then, as she recalled, she thought about the origin of the piece of paper. It was hidden in the bookcase of History of the Lone Kingdom's Aristocracy. That book was borrowed from Viscount Glaint's study. Suddenly, a name flashed in both Furs's and Zio's minds at the same time, Viscount Glaint. At that moment, Viscount Glaint was looking at the blackboard and said to himself with interest, "This honorific name is very rare. But it sounds very impressive." Just as he finished his sentence, he looked to his side in puzzlement, asking Furs and Zio, "Why are you looking at me like that?" "Nothing." Zio and Furs rapidly shook their heads at the same time. After dinner, in an elegantly decorated house, Audrey brought the huge golden retriever, Susie, into the living room under the guidance of her psychology teacher, Escalante. She was attending the academic meeting that had been agreed upon last week. Her maid and bodyguard stayed behind while she walked with Susie into a spacious activity room. In the activity room, be it for the atmosphere or some other reason, the gas lamps were not lit. The room was lit by gold-plated candle lamps on the coffee table and cupboard. Before Audrey could take a good look at her surroundings, she saw a gentleman in his 30s walking towards her. He wore a gray tailcoat. "This is the owner of this place, Mr. Stephen Hamprez, a furniture merchant." The long-haired Escalante introduced him. She was just about to tell him Audrey's identity when Hamprez chuckled and said, "Escalante, don't say anything. Let me have a chance at guessing." He had a neatly trimmed mustache and charming dark brown eyes. He appeared very gentle and elegant, nothing like a furniture merchant but more like a university lecturer. After seriously sizing up Audrey a few times, he smiled and said, "Escalante only mentioned that you were her student. Haha, I believe you're a cultured noble lady, and you aren't someone who only looks good. There's no need for you to worry about a decline in the quality of your life. You're a little excited, very curious, and a relatively simple but also full of love. Of course, the most obvious point is that you're very beautiful, just like an angel." He made a final joke, pressed his hand to his chest, bowed and said, "Welcome, the beautiful Miss Angel. You're right, as expected of a member of the Psychology Alchemists. However, what you managed to observe was the me from a few months ago. It's all a facade I've put on for myself." Audrey opened her mouth in surprise and astonishment. "Did you know me before, Mr. Hamprez?" She didn't let her shocked expression linger too long on her face, because such emotions were meant to be instantaneous and wouldn't last too long. If anyone were to be surprised for several seconds, then it meant that their performance was most likely an act. Audrey didn't notice this at first, but after watching others act all this time, she naturally came up with a lot of rules. "No, I still don't know you. This is just the basics of being a psychology enthusiast." Hamprez chuckled. Before he could finish his sentence, Audrey had already completed her observations and made a corresponding judgment based on her surroundings. His attire and the furnishings of his house all indicate that he's a person who cares deeply about how people view him. The sapphire on the ring of his left hand doesn't look small, but its actual quality is very ordinary. There are no symbols or magic labels on it. His finances aren't as good as he presents them to be. Even though he was very enthusiastic just now, the way he stands there, the direction in which his feet point, and the changes in his emotional colors all indicate that he still has many concerns and is on his guard. He sincerely commended me on my looks, but it wasn't in the way a man would look at a woman. There are signs of him using facial products, and his eyebrows are definitely drawn. His skills are inferior to my makeup maidservant, Solia, but they're better than mine. The cologne he uses is confusion, something that I've only seen women use before. Yes, he probably likes men, and the role he plays is the weaker one in the relationship. At the same time, Audrey expressed her longing skillfully. I'd love to have your observational powers, Mr. Hamprez. As she spoke, she maintained a faint smile while being introduced to the other 7 or 8 people in the activity room under Hamprez's and Escalante's lead. The lovers of both mysticism and psychology were either descendants of fallen aristocrats, associate professors at universities, or the children of the rich. For example, the father of a young man was the owner of Philip's department store, the most famous department store in Backland. In the exchange that followed, Audrey basically only listened. The only time she spoke was by asking questions, fully expressing her curiosity and yearning. In this academic discussion, Escalante and Hamprez deliberately mentioned the body of heart and mind, as well as the spirit world and the collective subconscious. They also shared some relatively unique points of view, allowing Audrey to gradually understand some of the questions she had accumulated all this time. When the discussion ended and they were out of the house, Audrey glanced at Escalante beside her and asked, with a little naivety, "Ms. Escalante, when will I be as good in psychology as Mr. Hamprez?" Escalante curled the corners of her lips and slightly tilted her head as she looked at her. Very soon. At night, Klein, who was about to get into bed, once again appeared above the gray fog. Despite being a little sleepy, he was jolted awake by the news Miss Magician had reported. The Aurora Order knows of the fool? They know of my honorific name? The true creator has locked onto me? Klein abruptly sat up straight, as though he was about to face an attack. He quickly rejected the final theory. If the true creator had indeed locked onto him, Mr. A would have long visited him on the pretext of collecting a copper penny for the gas meter. Perhaps, even a saint might appear. That is to say, only the fool and his corresponding honorific name are known, and the clues point to Backland. Who leaked the news? Klein frowned as he carefully thought about it. Soon he discovered a possibility. Little's son has recently chanted my honorific name, and it happened when he was interacting with a member of the exploratory team who was corrupted by the true creator. He held a sacrificial ritual, and there were likely symbols corresponding to the fool at the scene. The ancient palace above the gray fog appeared. So, the true creator sensed the existence of the fool and confirmed that I was the one who had been sacrilegious, no, harassing, no that's not right either, spying on him. Also, Little's son used the all-black eye at that time, which contains the mental corruption of the true creator. Through that, he has confirmed that my adorers and believers are in Backland? I can't take the all-black eye out in the future. Having roughly understood the problem, Klein was left with another problem. Mr. A announced the bounty for Mr. Fool's believers at a not-so-private, relatively open Beyonder gathering. Is he just dumb, or is he deliberately fishing? Sigh, the Aurora Order members are all bigoted lunatics. Their brains are mostly damaged, so it's impossible to deduce their real intentions. This is as the saying goes, as long as I'm crazy, you won't be able to guess what I'm thinking. Chapter 406. A joyous but extremely helpless reality above the gray fog, the magnificent palace stood silently. Klein drummed his fingers rhythmically on the edge of the long bronze table, concentrating on what he could do in the face of the threat of the Aurora Order and Mr. A. While having a hard time figuring out the other party's intentions, he instinctively came up with an idea. Report Mr. A. Report illegal gatherings. Klein could very easily learn of the location where Mr. A held the gathering through Miss Magician, and thus, He would be able to easily report it to the Nighthawks, the mandated Punisher, or the machinery hive mind in secret. An oracle of the Aurora Order was bound to garner enough attention. When that happens, Mr. A's safety would probably be at risk, so he probably wouldn't have the time or effort to track down the believers of the Fool. The problem, however, was that this was bound to implicate a group of innocent Beyonders, and Klein suspected that this was the reason why Mr. A directly offered a reward for the believers of the Fool. Perhaps he had long planned an escape. Once someone reports him, he would be able to confirm without a doubt that the Fool's believers were among the previous gathering members. As for who it was exactly, that wasn't important. Mr. A and the lunatics of the Aurora Order were definitely capable of taking exhaustive measures. And once these Beyonders fell into their hands, many of them would be unable to hide their secrets. The Aurora Order, or the Shepherd Pathway which represented the true Creator, are the best at corrupting others. When the ideology of a Beyonder was completely twisted and once they believed in the true Creator wholeheartedly, what else could be kept a secret? It's not like there's no other way. It's best not to report it. Klein leaned back in his chair, collected his thoughts, and reorganized the entire matter. As he was thinking, he suddenly realized a problem. There were no believers or adorers of the Fool in this world. Even the Tarot Club only had a few members, and no one had divulged the relevant information. In other words, the Aurora Order wouldn't be able to find any relevant clues. There's nothing to worry about. The only bad outcome is that the Fool is now targeted by the true Creator. Although being targeted by an evil god isn't a pleasant feeling, it basically wouldn't affect anything else. Klein nodded thoughtfully. He had thought it through very clearly. The only flaw in this matter was that he had once used the title of the Fool, written in the language of ancient Hermes, as a password for an anonymous account. However, with the sacrificial and bestowal rituals having proven useful, the account had long been abandoned and had long since been forgotten. Since the last month and a half, no one had been noticed by Klein for copying the password, so it was possible to deduce the actual situation. As such, bank employees, who had been in contact with the password but apparently do not understand mysticism, wouldn't be able to reveal it to anyone, and Beyonders would at most make requests in the loan language, so even if they find the right person, it's not possible to connect the content described in the loan language with that of the ancient Hermes password. If anyone had copied it down, I would be the first to know and would be able to respond effectively. Besides, even if someone finds the password, it would be difficult to trace it back to Sherlock Moriarty. I use a variety of means every time. Miss Justice is also sufficiently careful when saving money. While rapping the table, Klein relaxed and said with a chuckle, "You believe that the Fool has many adorers and believers and that this would result in many clues that cannot be hidden. Wrong, especially wrong. There's only one believer and adorer of the Fool. And that's me." When he said that, he couldn't help but let out a self-deprecating laugh. It doesn't seem like it's something that I should be proud of. I need to be a little careful for the time being. I shouldn't go around using the banner of the Fool. Klein reminded himself and went back to answering Miss Magician's prayers. He adjusted his posture and said in a low, gentle voice, "Don't worry about it." Don't worry about it? When Furs received the answer, she was surprised but also felt that it was only right. In the eyes of Mr. Fool, the Aurora Order is nothing but a bunch of ants. Furs once again recited his honorific name in a low voice, and she curiously asked, "Honorable Mr. Fool, which existence does the Aurora Order believe in?" Then she saw Mr. Fool sitting on a high-backed chair in the middle of the gray fog. He leisurely said, "The true Creator. The true Creator." Furz's eyes widened as she instantly understood why Mr. A suddenly sought out the believers of the Fool. With the help of the Tarot Club, that Sun youth in the City of Silver had successfully exposed the abnormality of the exploratory team and thwarted the true Creator's ploy. Behind this incident is a confrontation and struggle between Mr. Fool and the true Creator. Furs didn't dare to ask any further, and she quickly recounted her meeting with the members of the Abraham family. She also mentioned Lawrence's will, the strange notebook, and the Beyonder characteristic he had left behind. "Honorable Mr. Fool, what should I do?" she asked for advice with uncertainty. "What should you do? Miss Magician really is lucky." Why haven't I encountered such a good thing? Klein responded with a chuckle. Follow the true desires in your heart. He wasn't the least bit worried that Dorian Gray, from Pritz Harbor's Fishermen Association, would harm Miss Magician, because he knew she had 2 more stones on her bracelet, allowing her to teleport through the spirit world twice. Follow the true desires in my heart? Furs lowered her head in thought. I understand. Thank you, Mr. Fool. She decided to buy a steam locomotive ticket tomorrow. Using this mode of transportation, it would take a little over an hour to get from Backlund to Pritz Harbor, or maybe less. After reporting everything, Furs requested to hold a sacrificial and bestowal ritual. After receiving a positive response, she exchanged £600 in cash for the Sheriff Beyonder characteristic. Holding up the fist-shaped object comprised of black iron, dark red, and silver colors, as well as its beautiful spiritual radiance, Furs felt joy and admiration. Zio had long gathered the supplementary ingredients, so she would soon be promoted to Sequence 8. And I don't know when I'll become a trick master. I hope Mr. Hanged Man and the others can help me find the appropriate Beyonder ingredients as soon as possible. Zio had been subconsciously acting as an arbiter, so she didn't have to worry about her digestion of the Sequence 9 potion, but once she becomes a sheriff, what should she do? Should I ask permission from Mr. Fool to teach her the acting method, or should I simply suggest that she sneak into the police force? At the end of the long, mottled table, Klein looked at the thick stack of cash in front of him and carefully counted it several times. Through this method, I would have £1,230. I would still be short of £300 to obtain a single Sequence 6 Beyonder ingredient. Of course, £1,500 is the minimum price, and the actual transaction price is usually much higher than this. Where else can I get money these days? As soon as the bicycle patent is granted, shall I sell a portion of the shares? Yes, I almost forgot how special the Tarot Club is. The Werewolf Beyonder characteristic cannot be sold in Backlund for now, so as to avoid being discovered by high-sequence Beyonders from the Rose School of Thought. But I can always sell it elsewhere. I'll let the world entrust Mr. Hanged Man to sell it at the Sonia C. at the next gathering. I'll offer a corresponding amount of the commission as his reward. After subtracting the costs, the Werewolf Beyonder characteristic should give me at least £1,000. It will be more than enough for a single Sequence 6 Beyonder ingredient. Klein quickly came up with a plan and decided upon it. He found it a little regrettable that Miss Zio didn't seem to have much money. After she became a sheriff, even if she could quickly digest the potion, it would still take her a long time to buy the interrogator's Beyonder characteristic. And if the Abraham family were to take interest in Miss Magician, his subsequent astrologer potion formula would no longer be marketable. What a pity! Klein sighed and returned to the real world. Wednesday morning. Klein didn't suffer from insomnia due to being targeted by the True Creator and the Aurora Order's pursuit. He slept till daybreak and happily went out to buy a Desi pie for breakfast. There was no doubt that Desi pie required sweet iced tea to match it. As he enjoyed the food and flipped through the newspapers, he discovered the advertisement for the Ernst firm and learned that there would be a Beyonder gathering convened by Eye of Wisdom tomorrow night. This time, I'll be able to request to purchase the relevant Beyonder ingredients. But there's a high chance that it wouldn't be available. Even if there's something, it will be supplementary ingredients like the hair of a deep-sea naga. Klein seriously considered the channels in which he could find the ingredients. He spread out his left hand and counted with his fingers. From the Tarot Club, there are the outlets of Little Sun, Mr. Hanged Man, Miss Justice, and the rest. Beyond that, I have Eye of Wisdom's gathering, Miss Bodyguard and Marek, but I shouldn't contact them if possible for the time being. Also, yes, I have Vampire Emlyn White. Didn't he mention that he would write to ask some powerful sanguines? That's what social connections can bring about. Coming to this thought, Klein immediately decided to go to the Harvest Church to wait for Emlyn White. Although it was impossible for the Aurora Order to track him down, it still gave him a sense of urgency, making him want to gather the Beyonder ingredients as soon as possible. When he digested his potion, he would quickly advance to Sequence 6. 10 in the morning, south of the bridge, Rose Street. In his double-breasted frock coat, Klein took off his half-top hat and strolled into the rather small harvest church. At first glance, he saw the giant-like Father Yutravsky and Emlyn White, who was dressed in brown priest robes. The latter was wiping the candle lamps with a numb look on his face, as though he would rather be dead. What a coincidence! Wait, don't tell me he's here for the entire day? He only returns home at night? Klein casually found a seat and sat down. There were less than 5 devotees in the entire cathedral. Emlyn White also saw him and put down the rag. He walked over and sat beside him. The vampire's expressions suddenly became lively. He raised his chin and said with a chuckle, "You came here suddenly because you have something you need my help with, right?" Chapter 407. The True Adorer Inside the Harvest Church. Klein tilted his head to glance at Emlyn White. Without ruining the serene atmosphere, he deliberately suppressed his voice and laughed, returning with a question. "Are you short on money?" As soon as the words left his mouth, he felt as if he were asking if Emlyn knew about the multi-level marketing company, Amway. Emlyn was first taken aback before he scoffed. "Don't insult a noble sanguine with money." Klein instantly sneered. Looking at the tall and brawny Father Yutravsky in front of him, he said rather casually, "According to what I know, those handmade puppets are not cheap. They can even be called expensive, especially those that are as tall as a human." Emlyn gaped his mouth in an attempt to retort, but he failed to say a word. After a moment of silence, he coughed lightly, feigned indifference, and said, "Tell me, what is it that you want my help with? I'm not a sanguine who likes riddles." Klein didn't look at the vampire next to him. He smiled and said, "I have a friend who is about to advance. He needs to collect the relevant Beyonder ingredients. I wonder if you can help?" "Are you doubting the capabilities of a sanguine?" Emlyn White said arrogantly. "Even if I don't have them, I can write and inquire from the nobler excellencies." "That's what I want." Klein immediately responded with a deluge of words. "Mutated pituitary gland of 1,000-faced hunter and 100 milliliters of its blood. Characteristic of a human skin shadow and 5 strands of a deep-sea naga. As long as I can get any of these, I will pay you the corresponding price. The cheaper the price, the more you will be rewarded." He purposefully increased the number of supplementary ingredients to avoid any losses. Upon hearing this description without any stuttering, Emlyn White suddenly felt as if he had fallen into a trap of sophistry. He calmed his emotions and said, "The cost for the Beyonder ingredients is at least £100, while supplementary ingredients are at least £10. Although I'm not clear of the level of the things you want, I believe that they're definitely not cheap or common. Otherwise, you wouldn't have come to me for help." "Very smart." Klein laughed. "Deal." At this moment, Emlyn White had a deep suspicion that he was asking for too little. Therefore, he added, "Mr. Detective, do you have any clues on removing the psychological cues?" Seeing that Father Yutravsky was concentrating on his prayers at the altar ahead of them, Klein turned to glance at the vampire and said, "I have the simplest method." "What?" Emlyn White's red eyes lit up. "Defeat Bishop Yutravsky and snatch his mental terror candle away," Klein said with a chuckle. "After you meet up with your parents, you should possess the strength needed. Are 3 sanguines not the match of a single Dawn Paladin?" The corners of Emlyn's mouth twitched as his expression collapsed. "We lost. We couldn't beat him. My parents were nearly captured. That mental terror candle is really strange. So you've already tried?" The entire family almost converted to become believers of Mother Earth. 3 sanguines weren't even able to defeat Father Yutravsky? With the help of the mental terror candle and the blood transfuser, Father Yutravsky is that terrifying? Or are vampires too weak? However, all the rumors point towards vampires being rather powerful. Klein said in thought, "Then you can write a letter and ask for the help of the noble excellencies. There shouldn't be a lack of powerful experts among the sanguine." Emlyn White answered with a numb expression, "They refused." Suddenly, he looked at Klein with hope. "Can you defeat Father Yutravsky? Or could your friend beat him?" After receiving the sun brooch and the biological poison bottle and digesting most of the potion, I originally thought that I would be able to defeat Father Yutravsky in my spirit-body state. However, Your description just now made me uncertain. Is the mental terror candle that bizarre? This kind of sealed artifact is obviously great at restraining spirit bodies. Klein rationally shook his head. No way. He quickly changed the subject. Why would those noble excellencies of the sanguine refuse your request? To them, this should be a simple favor. Emlyn White's face instantly turned ashen. They say that Father Yutravsky is an adorer of Mother Earth. They do not wish to enter into direct conflict with him. They are studying means to remove the psychological cue. For example, they are venturing deep into the Sonia Sea, the Fog Sea, and the Berserk Sea, in search of the dragons that have long secluded themselves. He added with a smile even uglier than a weeping face, by the time they figure it out or find a dragon well-versed in the psyche domain, I might have already become a devout believer of Mother Earth. I'm beginning to appreciate how precious life is and how joyful a harvest is. An adorer of Mother Earth? Father Yutravsky is an adorer of Mother Earth? It's no wonder that he has so many mystical items. From the looks of it, as a powerful pirate, suddenly switching to the Mother Earth wasn't a simple matter. Klein sighed, and then he felt a sense of lingering fear. He had almost agreed to Emlyn White's request to attempt to defeat Father Yutravsky. If I lose, then I might even be locked up in the basement and forced into confinement. If I win, I might just offend another deity. No, there's no way of me winning. The adorer of Mother Earth definitely has an appropriate trump card. If it wasn't for Father Yutravsky suppressing his split personality, then I probably wouldn't have been able to defeat him. Klein wisely didn't pursue the topic. He once again looked at Father Yutravsky and said, "You can try to find an organization called the Psychology Alchemists. Otherwise, you'll have to wait for Miss Justice of our tarot club to become a psychiatrist. By then, you might be reluctant to break away from the faith of Mother Earth." Klein silently added. To him, it was best if Emlyn White also joined the Psychology Alchemists. That way, if Miss Justice encountered any problems in the organization, he could help her with other resources, and Klein wouldn't always have to summon himself, who was the trinity of the fool, an adorer, and a believer. Psychology Alchemists? I've never heard of it. Emlyn shook his head disdainfully. It must be a secret organization that recently appeared. This organization has existed for 100 or 200 years, at the very least. Klein denied his statement. For a sanguine with a long lifespan, 100 or 200 years means it recently appeared. Among the noble excellencies, a nap might be as long as a century, Emlyn White said proudly. Without waiting for Klein to speak, he looked ahead, cleared his throat, and said, "Do you know how to contact that organization?" Klein was going to answer that there was a man in the Tingen City's asylum named Dr. Daxter Guderian, who's a member of the Psychology Alchemists, but he stopped those words just before they came out of his mouth. With the true creator targeting me, it's best that I don't get involved with people or matters in Tingen. There's a certain risk of exposure, and once exposed with the Aurora Order's madness, they would definitely not let Benson and Melissa go. Klein slightly shook his head and said, "I've only heard of this organization. You can write and ask the other sanguine." Emlyn White was disappointed and stopped talking about it. He turned his head to look at Klein and said, "I'm guessing your friend who's about to advance is you." Klein looked forward without a care and replied leisurely, "Congratulations, you got it right." Emlyn White was stunned. This was completely different from what he had expected. Noticing his change, Klein laughed softly. "Mr. White, the most suitable job for you isn't to be an apothecary but to be an actor." Emlyn was stunned at first, but he immediately raised his head arrogantly and said, "I'm a deep, noble sanguine. I don't rely on my looks to make a living. Do you think I'm praising you for being handsome?" Klein slowly stood up and laughed. "No, I mean you are very talented at comedy." While Emlyn White's expression froze, he squeezed his way out to the aisle and said, "Don't forget what I entrusted you with." Pritz Harbor, White Oak Street. Furs Wall took the steam locomotive early in the morning and arrived at the kingdom's largest and most important port. She had also booked tickets for her return trip by boat, which was relatively inexpensive. Taking in the smell of the sea, Furs saw many of the dockworkers who were in a hurry. In the middle of each season, The port was swarming with temporary workers for relatively decent pay, and many poor people living in Backland's East Borough would head southeast on foot and in groups, traveling a distance of more than 60 kilometers. This was the same thing they did when harvesting hops. The roads are wider than Backland's, and the air quality isn't bad, but it's relatively dirtier. Furs looked around and found the Fishermen Association in an old building. Without much trouble, she met Dorian Gray in an office. The gentleman was of medium build, with exaggerated arms. His hair was combed rather neatly, completely unlike most of the members of the association who had hairstyles that looked like bird nests. He should also be an Abraham family member. After explaining the purpose of her visit, Furs passed Lawrence's will, along with the strange notebook and the diamond-like beyonder characteristic. Dorian received the items with a complicated expression before opening the will first. After reading it carefully, he lifted his head and looked earnestly at Furs with his blue eyes. "Your kindness and honor are praiseworthy. Ms. Wall, I shall always remember the help you provided Alyssa and Lawrence. Can you accept my gratitude? I wish to invite you to lunch." "No problem." Furs was still wondering how to pass the time before her ship sailed. Dorian immediately arranged for her to wait in the next lounge, offering black tea, snacks, newspapers, and magazines. Returning to the office, the gentleman opened a hidden cabinet with some misgivings and took out an item. It was a pure crystal ball shining with a radiant light. Chapter 408. A bold assumption. Dorian drew the curtains, cloaking the office with darkness before he sat down. He held the crystal ball in his left hand while touching its top with his right palm. As he stroked the crystal ball back and forth, he kept chanting softly. Gradually, the radiant points of light within the crystal ball began to shine brighter and brighter, becoming more and more obvious, as if the stars in the night sky were casting their reflections. Often used to determine the direction of fate, the stars in the trajectory of one's life surfaced one after another, forming a three-dimensional astrolabe with many revelations from the spirit world that resembled symbols. Dorian Gray finally stopped and studied it. She wasn't lying. That really was the trajectory of the situation. She seems to be able to bring about changes to the Abraham family, optimistic changes. As the light from the crystal ball dimmed, Dorian stood up, having already made up his mind. At lunchtime, in the Four-Winged Bird restaurant. In front of Furs lay a filleted fried fish which had rosemary scattered over it. Its skin was crispy, its meat fresh, and it didn't have any fine bones. It was rather tasty, but the only problem was that the cook had an extremely warped sense of aesthetics. He had deliberately kept the eyes of the fish bulging out of its head, and by plating the food, he made the fish look up, as though to express its indignation over its death. Furs pushed the head down, cut off the tail, and covered the upturned eye. At that moment, Dorian Gray began moving his fork and knife as he casually said, "Alyssa really liked mysticism and had done some research in this area. When you were packing her things, did you see any books, notes, or other items?" "There were some notebooks and books," Furs answered frankly. "As a result, I became a mysticism enthusiast, but unfortunately, I couldn't understand some of the content at all. For example, the sights in the spirit world. Not only was it absurd, illogical, and messy, incapable of expressing ideas, even if I forced myself to read it and systematically calm my impatience, it was still difficult to remember its contents. I would forget it once I finished reading it, let alone understand it." Furs added inwardly. Dorian nodded slightly and laughed. "Then you can consult me. I'm also a mysticism enthusiast, quite a proficient one if I may add." "Really? That's great." Furs answered appropriately. Seeing that she was really interested, Dorian immediately diverted the topic to mysticism. Sometimes he would bring up the spirit world, and sometimes he would talk about his cogitation experience. Having been prepared before he even stepped into the restaurant, he had deliberately chosen a secluded and quiet spot. Hence, he didn't need to fear that the customers around them would overhear their conversation. At the end of the lunch, Dorian offered, "I didn't know how to express my gratitude, but now I don't have to worry about it anymore. Haha, although Lawrence had paid you, I don't think that's enough to match your kindness, good-heartedness, and honor. Ms. Wall, You can write to me and ask about any questions you have about mysticism. That's the least I can do to express my gratitude. That's what I wish for. Furs didn't refuse. From the exchange just now, she could clearly tell that Dorian Gray possessed rich, systematic mysticism knowledge. He was indeed worthy of being a member of the ancient Abraham family. And this was also considered something she was lacking in. Although she had mastered quite a lot of knowledge about the beyonder world, it all came from a few books and notebooks that didn't go in-depth, as well as random information she had heard and experienced from the various gatherings she attended. It wasn't comprehensive or systematic enough, and it just had too many shortcomings. Upon hearing her reply, Dorian raised his cup and smiled. I hope that one day, we will also possess mysterious and extraordinary powers. Northborough in Backland. St. Samuel Cathedral. A group of men wearing black windbreakers and red gloves entered an underground area. The leader was a man in his 40s with soft facial features and long hair. Wearing a pompous top hat, he carried a black cane which was inlaid with gold. He quietly followed the Nighthawk leading the way and entered a rather spacious room. There were many bookshelves in the room, with various dossiers placed on them. A mesmerizing, beautiful woman wearing a black robe with blue eyeshadow and blush was leisurely sitting in a high-backed chair. She didn't get up to greet him. It was the former spirit medium, Daly. Soist, all the information you need is over there. Daly gestured with her chin at the table by the door. The middle-aged man named Soist smiled and said, Daly, why were you sent to guard this place? You should be tasked with more important matters. No, this is what I wanted. I need to settle down and read more information. Daly chuckled. This is to ease my future progress. Humans are fragile creatures, and they need a certain amount of time to calm down. No one can always be in peak condition, enjoying the thrill and pleasure without any rest. Your style really has never changed. Unfortunately, you've never given me the chance. Soist burst out laughing. Daly shook her head seriously and said, Obviously, you don't understand me. My current hobby has turned even more novel. If you can turn yourself into a rotten corpse or expose your white bones, then I'll definitely be filled with interest in you. She turned to look at the red glove behind Soist. Leonard, why did you choose to join his team? This fellow is conceited, arrogant, and gutless. He keeps fantasizing that women would take the initiative to crawl into bed, waiting for him. To be honest, perhaps this is the unique trait of a nightmare? When she mentioned nightmare, Daly visibly paused. Leonard helplessly said, Ma'am Daly, this was the arrangement of His Excellency Casimir. Is that so? I can see that you agree with my views on Soist, Daly concluded in a slightly husky voice. Leonard was momentarily at a loss for an explanation. Fortunately, Soul Assurer Soist didn't pay much attention to Daly's words. Walking over to the table filled with information, he picked up a dossier and flipped through it. Leonard and the others immediately surrounded him, imitating their leader. After the sound of paper flipping went on for some time, Soist casually asked, What's new in Backland recently? Something you think is worth paying attention to? Daly's eyes moved slightly. After thinking for a while, she said, A few Beyonders who work with us have passed on news that many people are searching for an organization that believes in the Fool, and they have given the corresponding honorific name. After describing the Fool's honorific name in the Loan language, she chuckled. I seem to be witnessing the birth of an entirely new cult. Of course, it might be the incarnation of an old friend. What do you think, Soist? Soist considered the matter seriously before saying, No, I've never heard of such an organization. At that moment, Leonard looked up from the dossier he was reading and mused, Could this have something to do with the 2 tarot rituals we're investigating? The Fool is the first card in a deck of tarot cards, the most important major arcana card. Daly froze for a second, then she nodded thoughtfully. That's an interesting idea. But there's no evidence. It's pure speculation, and it cannot even be considered a deduction, Soist said, disapproval within his tone. Leonard revealed a faint smile and said, Emperor Roselle once said to make a bold hypothesis and then carefully back it up. Hillston Borough, Quelag Club. As soon as Klein entered the hall after leaving the Harvest Church, he saw the equestrian teacher, Talem Dumont, sitting in a secluded corner, seemingly pondering over something. Noticing that lunch was still some time away, Klein went over and greeted him with a smile. "Good afternoon, Talem. You seem to have encountered another problem?" Talem snapped to his senses with a start and hurriedly shook his head. "No, nothing. You seem to have done something that you have a guilty conscience about?" Klein mumbled, sat down, and laughed. "It's a pity Aaron and Mike aren't here, otherwise we'd be having another pleasant afternoon." Talem smiled in response. "They're all busy and have very little free time." Without waiting for Klein to speak, he looked around and said, "Sherlock, there's an important figure who is very interested in you after hearing about your deeds. He would like to meet you. Would you be willing? Frankly speaking, this leaves me envious. It's a very rare opportunity." "Wait, what deeds did I do? Help Mrs. Mary catch her adulterous husband? Accompany reporter Mike to a brothel? Even in my past few trips to East Borough, I didn't do anything impressive. At the very most, they'd know that I made a contribution to the serial murders and that I helped Dr. Aaron resolve his nightmare by providing him with counsel." Klein was confused. After 2 seconds, he suddenly understood the reason. The important figure must have asked Talem if he knew of an excellent detective, and he could only think of me, so he offered to embellish descriptions about me that sounded pretty impressive, such as the true person who cracked the case behind the serial murders, the person who noticed that Mrs. Mary's former husband and his mistress had attempted to siphon funds from the coin company. I was probably described as being effective and sharp, a great detective who struck swiftly and precisely. This is how you tout each other in business. Klein sighed. He hesitated for a moment and said, "I'm sorry, Talem. But as a detective, I have my own principles, and that is to not get involved in matters involving important figures. On the stage of the higher-ups, what might be a sneeze-like friction among them might very well be an unbearable disaster for me. I won't paint a target on my back, so I won't see this important figure." This was actually something Klein had decided upon before he became a detective. He was prone to an investigation once he was involved with high society, therefore, before he became a faceless, he didn't want to bear such risks. "You're very rational." Talem sighed and said, "The important figure has anticipated this reaction and believes that such a detective is even more trustworthy, so he wishes for you to take on a commission that wouldn't involve high society." "What kind of commission?" Klein asked. Talem chuckled and said, "The Capim case which you and Mike were talking about last time. The important figure is very interested in the organization that uses tarot cards. He said that there has been more than one such case and wishes for you to find any relevant clues." Chapter 409. December what? Getting me to investigate myself again? Klein nearly suspected that this was a deliberate test. An organization that uses tarot cards to represent itself really is interesting, and I think so, but I don't want to sell myself out. Right? Capim's matter is clearly not that simple. He had a total of 4 Beyonders protecting him, so there must be a powerful faction behind him. What's the difference between investigating this case and being involved in high society strife? Well, this isn't something Sherlock Moriarty should know. Klein revealed a thoughtful expression, and while weighing his options, he said, "It's not easy to find a mysterious organization. Besides, it's very dangerous." Talem seemed to have expected his answer and chuckled. "Sherlock, there's no need for you to take risks. The important figure's intention is for you to pay more attention and to gather the relevant information or rumors. Here's £5 in cash, money for your activities. Even if you don't receive any valuable information, the money is yours. And once you gather any useful clues, he'll pay you per lead and reimburse you for your expenses throughout the process." Such good conditions? That important figure has put a lot of his attention on this matter. Does he have connections with the forces behind Capim, or does he wish to find the mysterious organization that uses tarot cards as a code name to help him? Reimburse. It's been a long time since I've heard someone promise me something like this. Since he's already gone so far by promising me such perks, it would appear very suspicious if a private detective were to refuse the commission. Furthermore, the matter of investigating myself should clearly be left to me. Klein hesitated for a few seconds and said, "All right, I'll do my best." He didn't stand on ceremony, and he accepted the 5 one-pound notes that Talim handed him, intending to provide a vague clue every week or two. Isn't the Aurora Order looking for the Fool? The Fool is obviously part of a tarot card. I hope that important figure will pursue this path all the way and get rid of Mr. A. A thought began to form in Klein's mind. Under St. Samuel Cathedral, Soul Assurer Soist assembled his team together to discuss their subsequent actions. He looked at the black-haired, green-eyed Leonard Mitchell and asked, half asking and half evaluating, "If I were to relegate this matter to you, how do you plan on investigating the 2 cases related to the tarot ritual?" Leonard lifted his hand to comb his hair, smiled, and said, "First, I would go according to my train of thought from before. I would do a reverse search for the people or organizations seeking the Fool's believers. They might know something. Second, I would reinvestigate the first 2 cases and place all the people involved in a name list, regardless of if they were suspects or not. Then, I'll use the powers of a nightmare to inquire and eliminate them one by one. The devil might be in the details, hidden in the person who's most improbable." Soist let out a chuckle. "I've read through the dossiers. These 2 cases involve a lot of people, each living in different places. Wanting to re-examine them is quite difficult, and some of them are already beyonders who are secretly active beneath the surface. They know how to hide themselves very well, and we have no way of knowing where they are. If we were to perform an investigation according to your idea, then what we need wouldn't be a small team. The church would have to inject at least 5 more Sequence 7 or above Nighthawks and the corresponding support personnel. The case we are in charge of is focused on the devil summoning case." Another red glove reminded Leonard. Leonard didn't seem angry as he let out a soft laugh. "I know. I'm only providing my point of view. As for whether or not it is used, or the extent to which it will be used will be decided by Captain Soist." He paused for a moment and revealed a puzzled expression. "I don't understand why the 2 cases related to the tarot rituals didn't have a high priority. The former involved an evil god's attempted descent, countless times more serious than a mere devil summoning." Soist picked up his coffee and took a sip before leisurely answering, "The Nighthawks have limited manpower. All cases require a certain priority level. Up to now, the secret organization represented by tarot cards hasn't expressed any obvious malice towards us. Their actions, to a certain extent, have helped us. For example, they foiled the descent of the true creator, as well as letting us know that the human trafficker, Capim, isn't a simple person. There must be some big secret underlying the matter." After saying that, he smiled and said, "Perhaps they can help us discover even more unsavory matters. Of course, the necessary investigations must be carried out. No one can guarantee that a secret organization will not end up being our enemy in the future." "I see, Captain Soist. Let's focus on the devil summoning case," Leonard said earnestly. In a Backland winter that was inseparable from fireplaces and fog, time flew by amidst these cold and gray sensations. In the blink of an eye, there was only half a month left until the new year. Klein extinguished the charcoal in the fireplace and put on a double-breasted frock coat over his dark red woolen vest. Nearly 3 weeks ago, Leopard finally received the bike patent and began looking for suitable second-round investors. Steam power mogul, from his cage, ended up showing some interest in this. After several meetings, the 3 parties agreed to conclude their final negotiations today. During the past month or so, Klein led an uneventful life. Through his investigations, he slowly digested the potion by strictly following the principles. Now, he was just short of a relatively bigger performance that he needed to initiate to completely digest it. If there are no urgent matters, I can avoid taking risks. It would take about another. As his mind wandered, Klein removed the half-top hat from the coat rack and smoothed the folds with a brush and handkerchief, removing the dust. The badge left behind by Lenevis indicated a January 4th gathering. He had no strong intentions on attending it. During this time, the Tarot Club continued being held on a weekly basis. Klein obtained a few pages of Roselle's early diary entries, allowing him to witness how he went from a weakling who only knew how to dream without taking actual action to becoming a playboy who actively hunted. Apart from this, he gained almost nothing. Although the werewolf Beyonder characteristic was handed over to the hanged man for sale via the world, a sale involving more than £1,000 was obviously not easy to close. The werewolf's unique trait of being cursed also caused many interested parties to shrink back from it. However, a few days ago at a tarot gathering, the hanged man told the world that he had contacted an artisan from the Church of the God of Steam, and the other party was clearly interested. Let's hope the deal will be closed this week. There are still no clues to the wind-blessed formula which Mr. Hanged Man wants. Klein packed his personal belongings, picked up his cane, wore his hat, and walked out the door. The wind-blessed potion formula was a sequence 6 formula. It wasn't that easy to encounter one. The hanged man, Alger, had waited for more than a month without receiving any good news. Justice Audrey, after undergoing a long period of observation and testing, was finally accepted by the psychology alchemists. She reported to Mr. Fool that she should be officially joining the secret organization this week, hoping to be blessed ahead of time to prevent any accidents from happening. For this, she was prepared to plunder at least 10 pages of Roselle's diary entries from the psychology alchemists for Mr. Fool without any compensation. As for the dragon specimen in Duke Negan's treasury, she had already confirmed that it was a 1,000-faced hunter. However, it was purely a sample that was without the corresponding Beyonder characteristic or flowing blood. The £2,000 she owed Mr. Fool's adorer wouldn't be repaid until February or March of next year. This was because, although she would officially come of age at the New Year's ball and be able to take charge of a portion of her fortune, she would still be under the supervision of her parents and wouldn't be able to sell them at will. Furthermore, she was still short of Viscount Glaine's final payment, so she needed ample time to raise the money in secret. The magician Furs, with the help of the hanged man, finally obtained the blood of a deep-sea marlin. She paid him £320 for it, which reduced her savings to £120. In order to make up for her loss and for the stomach pouch of a spirit eater, she began to furiously rush to write her new book, which quickly took shape. It told a story about adventure, love, traveling, storms, pirates, and many other elements fused into a whole. Her and Dorian Gray's correspondence never stopped, and the other party had recently announced that they would be coming to Backlund to pay their respects to Alyssa, Labero, and Lawrence. The son Derek, who was acting normally as suggested by the hanged man, continued his daily patrols, amassed merit points, and didn't attempt any rituals. At every tarot gathering he would skillfully pretend to be asleep, and he didn't reveal any problems for the time being. Usually, he would occasionally take a nap to prevent any irregularities from being detected which would put him under suspicion. According to him, Shepherd Elder Lovia didn't leave the bottom of the spire 7 days later and was still locked in there for unknown reasons. With the Aurora Order's Mr. A searching for the followers and adorers of the Fool, they failed to receive any valuable clues with Klein's deliberate attempt to keep a low profile. And the Beyonders, who knew the honorific name of the Fool, all understood that they should never chant such words carelessly. Unless they were in dire straits, and they definitely didn't have the courage to pray to an existence that was suspected of being an evil god. Emlyn mentioned the last time that he had some clues for the corresponding ingredients and that he might be able to confirm it soon, but the problem is that I'm lacking the money now. With a silent grunt, Klein took his cane and walked to Lawyer Jurgen's door. When the doorbell rang, he took the initiative and instinctively took 2 steps back. Not long after, the door opened and old Mrs. Doris cheerfully opened her arms to give Klein a warm hug. "Oh, the doctor you introduced last time was wonderful. My body hasn't been this healthy for almost 10 years. Doris, seeing that the detective was standing far away, could only fold her arms and express her delight and feelings in words. Klein said in an amused and exasperated tone, "Mrs. Doris, you've already told me this for the 9th time." He saw Brody, the black cat, sitting on top of the coat rack. Although it looked precarious, he was able to maintain his balance. "I can do that as well." Klein made a self-evaluation. "Is that so?" Old Mrs. Doris asked, perplexed. She immediately tossed the question to the back of her mind and said with a smile, "Are you here for Jürgen?" Klein immediately revealed a smile. Yes. Matters involving negotiations needed the help of a professional lawyer. Chapter 410. From his cage, St. George Borough, Surd Street. As soon as Klein and Jürgen alighted from the carriage, they saw a massive object parked in front of Inventor Leopard's door. It was iron-black in color, with a dozen wheels in 3 groups, the top of which towered like a ship's chimney, and smoke was emitted from it. It was a steam engine that Klein had seen in magazines and on the streets, often described by the public as an ironclad warship with a rather exaggerated body. If the streets that hadn't been built or rebuilt in the last 20 or 30 years, then it would have filled the roads and left no room for horse carriages. Therefore, transportation vehicles such as this could only be seen in certain areas and places. At this moment, the heavy glass window and door of the car opened, and 2 figures stepped out. One of them was the steam power mogul, from his cage, whom Klein had met before. A quarter of his blood was of the Fasak Empire, and he had pale blue eyes and a tall, but bulging build. He had a pipe in his mouth. The person beside him was wearing a heavy black coat with a gray scarf wrapped around his neck. His features were unremarkable. He looked common with his black hair and brown eyes, yet he exuded an inexplicable sense of familiarity. "Hi, Detective Moriarty, you're really punctual. This is my lawyer and partner, Pacheco Duane." While they conversed, 2 burly men got out of the steam-powered vehicle. They were obviously Framus's bodyguards. How unprofessional. Shouldn't they come down first and then open the door for their boss? Klein grunted, smiled in greeting, and introduced his lawyer, Jürgen. While he was waiting for Leopard to open the door, he casually chatted with him. "Mr. Cage, is this kind of steam-powered vehicle popular? Do a lot of people like it?" From his cage laughed. "Those who think that they're decent say that it's too barbaric and crude, and ordinary people can't afford it. Only I, an enthusiast of such machinery and steam, would be willing to buy it." "It's mainly because many streets are too narrow," Klein said in consolation. From his cage was the investor he found, and he had little to do with Leopard. When he was playing cards at the Quelag Club, he had deliberately mentioned it, and the equestrian teacher, Talim, immediately mentioned that Framus liked similar inventions, offering to introduce them to each other. This made Klein sigh with emotion. The club really was a great place to develop connections, and the members who joined it were never really interested in the free food, drinks, and activity venues. This is indeed one of the reasons. As the population increases and the cities grow larger, the horse carriage will definitely be eliminated. It's just too slow. What this world is pursuing now is efficiency," Framus said confidently. He then revealed a smile. "Also, I've already obtained an order from the military. They want me to make some improvements, just like it was mentioned in Roselle's manuscript. Increase the armor's bulletproof plating, cover the tracks so that it can drive on a simple road. In addition, add a thick cannon barrel, and then this will be a brand new weapon." Roselle's manuscript. Klein sighed silently, and for a moment he didn't know what to say until, finally, Leopard opened the door. In the discussion that followed, the main people talking were Jürgen and Pacheco. The 2 lawyers would argue with each other and discuss the terms with their employers, while the completely unprepared inventor Leopard sat there in a daze. Only when asked would he give his opinion. Finally, the 3 parties agreed that Framus would invest £1,000 to take 20% of the shares, and the shares of Klein and Leopard would fall by an equal ratio, 28% and 52%. At the same time, Framus agreed to buy a further 18% of Klein's shares at a premium, and this cost him £1,000 after taxes. Similarly, he would buy a 9% stake in the company at a post-tax price for £500. As a result of this deal, Framus became the largest shareholder in the newly established Backlund Bike Company, with a 47% share. He became responsible for the subsequent industrialization and marketing, while the company would be funded with the £1,000 he invested as the initial capital. Leopard was the second largest shareholder, with 43% of the shares. His job was to help in the setting up of the assembly line for mass production. "Mr. Klein, who only had the remaining 10% of the shares, became a purely financial investor. And the £1,000 he earned from selling his shares had sent his personal wealth skyrocketing to £2,235, almost enough for him to buy a main ingredient for a faceless potion. As a private detective, he still continued accepting commissions in the past month or so his daily expenses didn't drain his savings. I still have to pay £50 to lawyer Jurgen, leaving me with £2,185. I'll have to thank Talum when I see him. A thought flashed through Klein's mind. He signed and stamped the contract. Then he stood up and shook hands with Fromis and Leopard. I hope for a pleasant partnership. Fromis took out his golden pocket watch and looked at it before chuckling. Normally, we should have lunch together to celebrate the closing of a deal, but there's an important person waiting for me. I'm really sorry, but there will still be a lot of opportunities in the future. An important figure, another one. The one behind Talum? The one that I claimed reimbursement from using fake information that points to the Aurora order? Klein suddenly felt a little guilty. He hurriedly smiled and said that he didn't mind. After exiting the house and getting into a carriage, Jurgen suddenly frowned slightly. Sherlock, you agreed too readily. Why do you say that? Klein asked curiously. He didn't even know what Jurgen was talking about. Jurgen said rather seriously, when we were talking about the transfer of shares. Based on your description, and on Framis's performance, I can imagine a bright market prospect for bikes. Although it's just an invention at the moment, deflating the overall valuation, you should have kept more shares even though £5,000 is a good price. That way you can get better returns in the future. I thought you were only going to sell 8% and have the confidence to haggle for £500, but you actually agreed to 18%. Even if it were only £500, you would have made a several-fold return on the investment. You shouldn't have been in such a hurry. Because I'm in need of money. However, I did agree very readily without any hesitation. It was a huge transaction, so that does seem rather abnormal for me. As Klein thought back to the scene from before, he began to have some doubts deep down. Was I unconsciously influenced by Fromis or that lawyer Pacheco? One of them is a beyonder? Fortunately, the price was fairly reasonable. As he pondered over the matter, Klein said to Jurgen, who was waiting for an answer, "The new year is coming soon." He had no idea how to explain it, so he randomly chose an opening. If the other party was a smart person, then they would go along with the opening and perfect the explanation with their own reasoning. There was no need for Klein to describe it any further. Of course, this was a move aimed at smart people. Ordinary people would end up pressing, or what exactly happened? Lawyer Jurgen was obviously a smart man. Noticing Klein's brief silence, he nodded and said, I understand. What do you understand? I haven't even thought of what to say. Klein pointed to the steam metro station in front of them and said, I'm getting off here. I need to meet an informant. As the steam-powered vehicle roared forward, Fromis, who was sitting in the front row, wound down the window and blew out a ring of smoke. He said to the inconspicuous lawyer Pacheco, Did you use your powers just now? It was passively triggered, Pacheco said with a smile. My powers aren't suitable for such situations. I prefer to face government or enterprise employees. Fromis nodded slightly. I just wanted to remind you. There's no need to use your powers in such situations. Do not let this affect what matters most. I understand, Pacheco replied in a low voice. East Borough in a cheap coffee shop. When Klein arrived, old Kohler was already waiting for him. He removed his scarf, took off his hat, sat down across him, fished out a stack of 1 soldi notes, and handed it to him. For next week's expenses and a bonus for the information you provided me the last time. That's a total of £1. He was recently very generous with giving bonuses since he had already found a person to claim them from. Old Kohler, whose face was clearly ruddier than before, received the cash, feeling a little embarrassed. The information I gave you previously didn't seem to be that important. No, the importance depends on who wields it. There are a lot of things that you might find trivial, but it's how other people earn their money, Klein explained with a laugh. What happened this week? Old Kohler took the stack of bills and stuffed it into his pocket. he said thoughtfully. Just like before, many people are still looking for the believers of the fool. How could anyone believe in the fool? That isn't a good name. The corners of Klein's mouth slightly twitched. Are they making progress? The Aurora Order is really persistent. Klein thought helplessly. No, there's no such person. Old Kohler shook his head and then said, there are a few people organizing strikes recently. They came to me a few times, claiming that they will be fighting for reasonable working hours and salaries. It's a very normal thing in this era, but it can lead to quite serious consequences. Klein thoughtfully said, pay attention to the organizers of this matter. But don't be too anxious. Safety first. All right. Old Kohler cleared his throat and said, there have been a lot of gangsters and bounty hunters looking for a person these days. I don't know why, but I believe someone has offered a bounty. Who are they looking for? Feeling the cold, Klein took a sip of his coffee. The warm liquid ran down his esophagus and warmed his belly. Old Kohler thought for a moment and said, a man named Isaac Eggers. Isaac Eggers? Isaac Eggers? Klein looked up from his coffee cup and stared straight at Old Kohler, who was sitting across him. Isn't that Mr. Isaac's full name? Why would someone suddenly offer a bounty for him? In Sangwell? Relying on his clown powers, Klein feigned indifference as he asked, did it say what kind of person he was? Old Kohler recalled and said, he seems to be of Balaam lineage and was once a university lecturer. Chapter 411. Coming in Throng seems to be of Balaam lineage, a university lecturer. It really is Mr. Isaac, not someone sharing the same name. Using the information provided by Old Kohler, Klein basically confirmed that the person the bounty was aimed at was the suspected descendant of Death, Isaac. Here lies the problem. Who or what organization is looking for Mr. Isaac? The numinous episcopate whose ultimate goal is to revive Death? In Zangwill who likes to play the mastermind behind the scenes? It's unlikely to be the latter. In Zangwill has sealed Artifact 0-08, which allows a target to act according to his descriptions, and through a series of coincidences, he can achieve his desired objective. There's no need at all for him to use the gangs and bounty hunters to find Mr. Isaac? Wait, what if this is actually an arrangement by sealed Artifact 0-08? Realizing that he's now the target of Mr. Isaac but lacks the confidence to clinch victory in battle, Zangwill is using 0-08 to instigate conflict between Mr. Isaac and some particular faction, hoping to eliminate his enemy indirectly. And this reward was issued by that faction? It's very possible. However, I can't rule out the numinous episcopate. To get revenge, Mr. Isaac might have made contact with them. However, there were major differences between the two parties regarding the resurrection of Death, which eventually led to a falling out. Klein instantly thought of two possibilities and the corresponding reasons. He took a sip of his coffee and said to Old Kohler, help me find out who issued this bounty and its exact price. If it's appropriate, I'll take note of it while I'm at it. No problem. Old Kohler didn't feel that anything was amiss with Klein's request. From a certain perspective, there were no essential differences between a private detective and a bounty hunter. The only difference was that the former would involve themselves in trivial matters such as catching adulterers in the act, finding cats, and helping others walk dogs, while they tended to use the powers of deduction more than brute force. When Old Kohler finished describing what he had seen and heard, Klein briefly taught him some of the tricks of leading a conversation based on the Nighthawk's curriculum, as well as the contingency plans for specific scenarios. It's time for me to go to the docks. Thank you, Detective Moriarty, for allowing me to lead a good life once again. Old Kohler picked up the old, worn-out hat on the table and thanked him sincerely. The detective, in his view, not only provided him with a well-paid job, but he also taught him many useful things. Even if the detective no longer needed him as an informant, the skills he learned would allow him to barely survive in East Borough, especially since he was growing older and less capable of laborious work. A good life. In my opinion, what you have now is the basics of what a person should have. After watching Old Kohler walk out the cheap coffee house, Klein sat there in a daze. This was the first time that he had heard a friend's name from someone else since his arrival in Backlund, and it was also the first time that he might have grasped in Zangwill's whereabouts. For the past 3 months, Klein's main goal had been to digest the potion and enhance himself, especially after he killed Lenevis. That was because he knew very well that he and Zangwill, who was most likely a high-sequence beyonder, had an unbridgeable gap. He couldn't be impatient for revenge, especially when it came to the chilling sealed artifact 0-08. He didn't even have the intention to approach and investigate it. Scenes from the Blackthorn Security Company in Tingen replayed themselves in Klein's mind, and those bright polished shoes clearly appeared before his eyes. Raising his head and slowly letting out a breath, Klein took his scarf and hat and walked out of the cheap coffee shop. Hillston Borough, outside a rather old building. Klein got off the carriage, pressed his hat, and went straight to the door. It was Isengard Stanton's house. The great detective had written to Klein a few days ago, inviting him to come over to discuss a murder case. Mr. Klein, who has been busy with the financing of the bike project, tactfully replied that he had no time to spare as a form of rejection. To his surprise, Isengard Stanton didn't seem to mind and said that the case had hit a brick wall, making it unlikely that there would be any breakthroughs anytime soon. He was very willing to wait for Detective Sherlock Moriarty's visit and expressed how he looked forward to an exchange that ignited sparks of wisdom. As such, Klein could only first divine a suitable date for the visit, picking the closest date after the negotiations, which happened to be this afternoon. With that, he wrote back and fixed an appointment. Ding dong, ding dong. Klein rang the bell twice and stepped back to wait. More than 10 seconds later, the door creaked open, and the assistant of the great detective, Isengard, said with a smile, "Good afternoon, Detective Moriarty. Mr. Stanton is waiting for you in the activity room. Would you like coffee or tea?" The assistant was thin and wore gold-rimmed glasses. He looked both refined and professional. Klein looked up at him and said, "Be sparing on the lemon slices." "No problem." The assistant led Klein into the living room, pointed to the activity room and said, "Sorry, our servants are only temporary, and they just happen to be on their day off today, so I can only trouble you to go over alone." Klein nodded and walked towards the activity room on the first floor. As he lifted his hand to knock on the door, he suddenly felt that something was amiss. "I arranged a visit with Mr. Stanton a few days in advance. Why would I chance upon the temporary servant's day off?" Klein's eyes narrowed, and he pulled out a copper penny. At this moment, the door to the activity room opened due to the knock, producing a tiny crack. In the blink of an eye, as if some seal was lifted, the strong smell of fresh blood poured out and overwhelmed Klein's nose. From what he could see, the reclining chair in the activity room was overturned and was stained with dark red blood. A book lay beside it, its cover facing up. With just that one glance, Klein felt as if he was seeing a murder scene. The name of the book caught his eye, The Devil's Legend of Civilau's Burrow. Devil. Klein was about to make a move when a strong wind suddenly blew in the activity room, quickly pulling the door back. Klein clearly saw the entire interior of the activity room. The charcoal in the fireplace had long since burned out, and there was no longer any red embers glowing. The coffee table, the sofa, the chairs, the cupboard, and other items had either fallen or shattered. It appeared as if he witnessed an intense battle. There was a lot of blood on the carpet and walls and a lot of scorch marks, but there was no sign of a body at the scene, not even a stump limb. Something happened to Detective Stanton? Klein suddenly took a step back, intending to first leave the place. However, almost at the same time, he felt someone lock onto him. Someone was staring at him with a cold and merciless gaze from an unknown location. The moment he made a mistake in his response, he would immediately be met with a fatal blow. How can this be a suitable day to visit Isengard Stanton? Was my interpretation of the revelation wrong? Klein didn't dare to act rashly. However, he was neither too nervous or flustered. Having experienced many battles and performances, he knew that he needed to stay calm during such moments. Tap tap tap. Isengard Stanton's assistant walked over with a tray. On the tray was a tin teapot and 2 white porcelain cups. The assistant froze in place when he saw the scene in the activity room. He looked at Klein, his face suddenly filled with fear as he stuttered, "You killed Miss Stanton, Every time he said a word, a piece of flesh fell from his face as blood gushed out. After he finished speaking, his body was torn to shreds, turning into a dismembered corpse. It was as if he had always been in that state, with everything preceding this being him in a state where he was stitched up. Clang, crack. The tin pot and white porcelain cup hit the ground at the same time, rolling or splashing, and the tea water quickly soaked the area. Klein didn't move as he stood there watching everything that had happened. This was because he still felt like he was being watched. The person who had caused the series of events appeared to be waiting for him to make a move before leaping onto his back and snapping his neck. After an unknown period of time, in a silent and eerie stalemate, Klein saw the door to Isengard Stanton's house open up as a group of policemen in black and white checkered uniforms stormed in. When they found the nauseating and dismembered corpses on the floor, they drew their revolvers and pointed them at Klein, who stood at the doorway of the activity room. Despite facing the black muzzles of the guns, Klein relaxed. The wordless gaze that seemed to hold a gun to the back of his head disappeared at that instant. Klein raised his hands and laughed helplessly. "I won't say anything until I see my lawyer." Backlund's Chisak police station. Chained to a water pipe, Klein met lawyer Jürgen once again. "I will accompany you during the interrogation." There was nothing unusual about Jürgen's expression, as though Detective Moriarty belonged here. Klein sighed and said, "What a tragedy. I should be considering what I will be eating tonight, not talking to a stone-faced police officer." The thing he was most thankful for today was that due to the Aurora Order's investigation and the attention of the Rose School of Thought's high-sequence Beyonder, he didn't bring any Beyonder items with him. His only revolver was easily concealed from the body search using a magic-like performance. When he entered the interrogation room, he recounted the letter he received from Isengard Stanton about discussing a case without the police officer's questioning. "Later, we'll go to your house with Mr. Jürgen to retrieve these letters. I hope they're still there." The officer in charge of the interrogation switched gears and asked, "How did you get to know Detective Isengard Stanton?" Klein replied without hesitation, "Because of that serial murder case." At this point, he suddenly froze for a moment. It reminded him of something. He had always suspected that there was a master behind the devil dog, the person who had harumphed when the devil dog was killed. Yes, the book Stanton was reading before the attack was The Devil's Legend of Civilau's Burrow. Could it be that the owner of the devil dog is beginning to take revenge after lying low all this time? And Detective Stanton was the person in the police records who provided the main clues or ideas. Furthermore, he was the one who received the bounty reward. Klein quickly had a theory. Chapter 412. Later, when he thought about the possibility that the devil dog's owner was involved, Klein changed his strategy and decided to recount his involvement with Isengard Stanton in great detail. In addition, he took the initiative to mention Isengard Stanton's assembly of a team of detectives to investigate the serial murder and the portion of the bounty that they successfully obtained. In that commission, although I only gave some ideas, well, in the jargon of the private detective industry, I provided suggestions, but it was still considered the greatest contribution by Mr. Stanton, so I received the bulk of the bounty, Klein concluded. The two officers in charge of the interrogation jotted down the information and asked if anyone could prove it. Klein gave them the names and addresses of Stewart, Kaslana, and the other private detectives. "Very good, Mr. Moriarty. Your answer is detailed enough." A police officer stopped writing and asked, "How long did you spend in Isengard Stanton's home today? I mean, from the time you entered to the time we found you." Klein thought for a moment and, without consulting lawyer Jürgen, directly replied, "About 2 to 3 minutes." What he said was based on what he truly felt. Another police officer raised his eyebrows and said, "Many residents nearby were able to confirm that you entered Isengard Stanton's house around 2:10 p.m. We arrived at the scene at 2:28 p.m., which is to say, you were in the house for about 18 minutes, not 2 or 3 minutes. What exactly were you doing during this lengthy period of time? Why didn't you leave and call the police?" 18 minutes passed? Klein frowned suddenly. He felt that the stalemate he had with the existence which silently watched him lasted for slightly more than a minute. How did it take a full 18 minutes? Was it the strange feeling of being watched that confused my grasp of time, or was it something else? Is it the beyonder powers of the other party? If it really was the owner of the devil dog, he would at least be at sequence 6, with a high probability of being sequence 5. While Klein pondered, Jürgen leaned forward, ready to accuse the police of being posing leading questions. That was not a very good reason, but he simply wanted to use this method to interrupt the pace of the interrogation and delay the unfavorable question for his client. At this moment, Klein raised his hand to rub his forehead. What I just said was the truth. Based on what I felt, only 2 or 3 minutes had passed after I entered Detective Isengard Stanton's house. Upon saying that, he emphasized, "Yes, based on what I felt." The two officers exchanged looks before writing the statement down. After a moment of silence, the officer who had asked the question said, "During those 18 minutes, a servant who came back from outside the house rang the doorbell, but no one answered, so he looked in through the oriel window and saw the floor full of corpses and that you were standing in the doorway of the activity room. He was terrified, running to the police station like a madman, and many passers-by and some residents had confirmed that." Klein ignored the look in Lawyer Jürgen's eyes and shook his head. "I didn't hear the doorbell." The two officers exchanged looks again, but they made no comment. All they did was jot down what was said. They asked questions about other details, and Klein, who had done nothing and was free from guilt, answered every question truthfully. At the end, he couldn't help but ask, "Did you find Detective Isengard Stanton? It didn't seem like the activity room had a corpse. He's likely to be still alive, right?" A police officer used a pen to tap on the table and said, "That's one of the things we're wondering about. Only the activity room in the house had signs of fighting, and the windows were closed, and they hadn't been opened for days. As you know, it's very normal to do so during Backlund's autumn and winter seasons. The attacker and Mr. Isengard Stanton left the room in a strange way, and we found no trace of him anywhere else in the house or in the neighborhood, not even blood." Without waiting for Klein to speak, he questioned before answering his own question, "You definitely wish to mention the activity room's door and the door to the house, but many people have confirmed that there was no pursuit nearby, nor was there anyone taken hostage or a corpse being moved away. Maybe it really happened in the middle of the night? Maybe they were able to go through walls?" Klein silently offered other possibilities in his mind, and he silently prayed. May the goddess bless Detective Isengard Stanton and that he escaped the disaster. The Evernight goddess was the empress of disaster and horror. When the interrogation was over, Klein was remanded in a small room, and the police sent someone to pick up the letter as evidence with Lawyer Jürgen at 15 Minsk Street. It wasn't until the evening that Klein was finally admitted bail, posting a sum of £50. It's much more expensive than the last time. It's difficult for the average private detective to produce that much cash in a short period of time. After leaving the Chisak police station, Klein pulled up the collar of his tweed coat and complained to Jürgen. Jürgen still wore a professional and staid expression. "The situation was favorable towards you the last time, but this time, much of the evidence points to you." He stopped a rental carriage, turned his head to the side, and looked at Klein. "Sherlock, I'm your lawyer. Before you answer the policeman's questions, it's best that you communicate with me, even if it's just sending me a look. Do not speak carelessly even if you feel that there are no problems. Ordinary people who haven't been trained will easily say things that trip them up. I'm used to fabricating my own stories and solving my own problems." Klein recalled what had just happened and gave a hollow laugh. "Okay, I will keep that in mind." Without another word, Jürgen boarded the carriage. Klein sat down across him and thought about Detective Isengard Stanton's attack. As he was thinking, he suddenly heard the rumbling sound of his stomach. "It's already past my normal dinner time." Klein took out his gold pocket watch and opened it. He didn't want to waste any more energy preparing food, so he began to think about which restaurant was worth looking forward to. At that moment, Jürgen raised his eyelids and said, "I've asked my grandmother to prepare dinner for 3. How can I impose on you?" Klein was startled for a moment before he laughed. Mrs. Doris's cooking skills are always something to look forward to. By the time they got back to Minsk Street in Sherwood Borough, the sky was completely dark and the street lamps were even brighter than the indistinct red moon in the sky. After having dinner at the Jurgens house and having fun with the cat, Klein strolled back to Unit 15 in the cold, damp air. He habitually rummaged through the letterbox and pulled out a copy of the Backland Evening News that had just arrived. Klein opened the door with the newspaper in hand, and just as he put the cane away, he realized something was wrong. His spiritual intuition as a seer told him that a stranger had entered his house. Was it the police who came to collect the evidence? Klein looked around warily and suddenly saw a letter on the coffee table. There should have only been newspapers sitting there. Klein entered the living room warily, in preparation for an attack. He moved closer to the coffee table, and during the entire process, the surroundings were completely silent without the slightest abnormality. Glancing down at the letter, Klein first took out a pair of black gloves and wore them before opening the letter. There was a thin piece of paper inside the envelope. After unfolding it, a dark red color was immediately reflected in Klein's eyes, and the faint smell of blood lingered around his nose. Words were written on the piece of paper with coagulated blood. "All of you will die." Is it really the owner of the devil dog? Is he taking revenge on the people who caused his subordinate's death? This is truly a case of bullying the weak and fearing the strong. Why not directly find the Nighthawks responsible for the cleanup operation? Klein's heart tightened, and many thoughts flashed through his mind. But he quickly dismissed his complaint. It was very normal to exact vengeance on the person that one could handle. Just like his past few months in Backland, he had never thought of finding Nsangwil, but he never gave up his pursuit of Lenevis. After looking around again, Klein gradually found that this matter was a little confusing. Isn't he afraid of being caught by the official Beyonders by using such an ostentatious method to exact revenge? Is this the acting requirement for his potion? Or, rather, because Detective Isengard Stanton escaped, he knows that he can't get rid of his targets in secret, so he can only switch his methods. But what's the reason behind this method? Also, when I was at Detective Stanton's house, he was clearly watching me. Why didn't he make a move? Was he apprehensive towards an ordinary private detective like me? No, impossible. Does he know that I'm a Beyonder? Possible. Due to the side effect of me getting lost due to the master key, I had met with the devil dog. It saw my body and how I looked like. Although I was disguised, I can't be certain that a devil can see through it. Perhaps, after that incident, it was able to present the scene to its owner in some way. However, at that time, I couldn't even defeat the devil dog, so I could only run away pathetically. What is there to be afraid of? Unless he's worried about something else, such as the injured Isengard Stanton who might be hiding nearby? Did he write to me very openly, thinking that I, a wild Beyonder, wouldn't dare to seek help from the officials? With his head filled with questions, Klein inspected the house and walked all the way to the second floor. When he opened the bedroom door, another letter came into view. The letter lay quietly on the desk, as though it had been waiting for him for a very long time. Klein opened the letter and saw a line of dark red words that were drawn. "You're next." How arrogant. Klein couldn't help but sigh. At this moment he suddenly had a thought. He raised his head and looked outside the window. Across him were a few two-story houses with their lights on. The glow of the street lamps fell on their outer walls, forming a crisscrossing zone. All of a sudden, the shadows in the areas squirmed and twisted, forming a black shadow in a tailcoat. The shadow raised its right hand, gesturing in the shape of a gun, and pointed it at Klein. Then, it retracted its arm and blew at the gun's muzzle. Immediately after, it silently fell back, transforming into countless disconnected shadows. Chapter 413. Visitors inside the Rice police station, which was in charge of Minsk Street and the surrounding district. Klein shook hands with the officer who escorted him out. This threatening letter must have had something to do with the previous serial murders. The organizer of the detective team, the great detective, Mr. Isengard Stanton, has already been attacked this afternoon. Please take it seriously. The police officer retracted his hand and said, "Don't worry, Mr. Moriarty. We definitely won't ignore your suggestion and immediately report it to the higher-ups." "Thank you so much." Klein put on his hat and walked out the door. After seeing the 2 threatening letters and the provocation from the suspected devil dog's master, Klein didn't hesitate to bring the evidence to the nearest police station to report the case. He secretly hoped that the matter would be transferred to the mandated punishers or the machinery hive mind team as quickly as possible so that he could be placed under the protection of official beyonders. Although he no longer had any reason to keep his identity as a detective, being fully capable of giving up his residence at 15 Minsk Street and switching to another residence and identity, he suspected that this might have been the purpose of the author of that threatening letter. Using the fear of wild beyonders being exposed, the perpetrator was forcing him to flee under the cover of the night. Then, during this process, he could seize the opportunity to launch an attack. Actually, it's quite a suitable time to attack me while I was heading over to the police station to report the incident. It's the same as when I was at home. That fellow has other plans. Confused and wary, Klein returned to Minsk Street. As soon as he got out of the carriage, he saw a figure loitering in front of his house with the help of the street lamps amid the drizzle. Klein's heart skipped a beat, but he immediately relaxed as he recognized the visitor. It was Stuart, a slim private detective with a medium build, who adored him. "I can't be careless. What if the subsequent sequences of Devil has a power similar to Faceless?" Klein gripped his cane tight and slowly approached, then he gave a probing shout. Detective Stewart abruptly turned his head and nervously said, "Mr. Moriarty, I received a threatening letter. It said, 'All of you will die.' You received it as well?" Klein blurted out in surprise while also finding it understandable. Stewart was also one of the detectives that Isengard Stanton had gathered for the investigation of the serial murders. Stewart's eyes widened abruptly. "You received it too?" "Yes." Klein nodded seriously. "More than one actually," he added silently. "What should I do?" "I first went to visit Mr. Stanton, but I heard that he was attacked, so I immediately came to you." "Oh, thank God for his blessings. I was about to leave." Stewart blurted out. Klein pointed to the door. "Let's talk inside." After entering the living room, Klein excused himself to the bathroom and hurriedly went above the gray fog to perform 2 divinations. First, it was to confirm that the person was Stewart, and second, if there was any relatively serious danger that night. He received a revelation confirming both. In other words, Stewart wasn't the enemy in disguise, and it would be a night of considerable danger. Of course, that danger might not happen right in front of Klein, but someone might be wiped out in secret. That was the limitation of divination. All he could receive was a revelation of a certain degree, not the entire answer. He was unable to get a precise answer. Furthermore, the limitations in mysticism couldn't be solved by techniques such as exclusion or dichotomy. Returning to the real world, Klein pressed the mechanical button of the toilet bowl, and in the midst of the splashing water, he washed his hands and opened the door. "Stewart, would you like coffee or tea?" Klein asked in a completely composed manner. Stewart stood up and shook his head. "No, we should discuss the problem first. Although I've received many threatening letters in the past, none of them can be compared to what I received today. He must have written them using fresh blood. My intuition tells me that he'll definitely take action, and that he has the ability to do so. By the way, Mr. Stanton was attacked by that same person, wasn't he?" "I think so," Klein said stoically before sitting down. "This likely has something to do with the previous serial murders. The common thing that you, me, and Mr. Stanton share in common is that case." Stewart's reaction is a little too extreme. Is he spooked out by the attack on Mr. Stanton? At the same time, Klein was carefully observing Stewart. Being infected by his attitude, Stewart calmed down significantly. He sat down again and said while deep in thought, "It seems to be the case." Before he could finish his sentence, tinkling sounds suddenly echoed in the room. Someone had rung the doorbell. Stewart instantly jolted, like a frightened bird. Klein frowned as he looked at him before getting up to head for the door. As soon as he touched the handle, the scene outside appeared in his mind. The visitors were Detective Kaslana in her gray tweed coat, her red-haired assistant, Lydia, and several other men who looked familiar. They're all the private detectives who Mr. Stanton had assembled. As expected, as Klein recalled, he recognized the visitors. He pulled open the door and took 2 steps back. With bushy eyebrows and slightly drooping cheeks, Kaslana looked at Klein and Stewart, who was behind him. Without exchanging pleasantries, she bluntly said, "We've all received the same threatening letter, so I believe you guys did too, right?" "Yes," Klein replied solemnly. Kaslana didn't shy away from exhaling a breath of white mist. "We were all assembled by Mr. Stanton to participate in the investigation of the serial murders. That's the only thing we have in common." "I think so too." Klein pointed inside his house. "Let's talk inside." Watching the 6 private detectives enter, Klein quickly analyzed the intentions of the Devil Dog's master. To stir up such a huge commotion, this will soon attract the attention of the official Beyonder organizations. Who knows, there might be a demigod powerhouse guarding this area, so how would he take his revenge? He's just being provocative, making the military and the Beyonders from the 3 churches send people to protect all these private detectives. With the official Beyonders not daring to be negligent, it will scatter personnel and exhaust them by making them run around. Is all this to take revenge on the main target of the attack from back then? In the process, he might even have a chance to kill some of the official Beyonders. As for the private investigators, he will only take action much later, once their wariness has relaxed. Of course, if probes such as this give an opening, then he definitely wouldn't let it go. To devils who can sense danger ahead of time, this is a method that plays on their strengths. However, the 3 churches, together with the military and the royal family, have many experts and sealed artifacts. They have no lack of demigods or grade 0 and grade 1 sealed artifacts. Is the master of the Devil Dog so certain that there are no powers or items that can restrain this strength of his? No, he definitely wouldn't dare. The official powers, especially the Nighthawks, mandated punishers, and machinery hive mind, have been fighting devils for who knows how many years. In the 4th epoch, even in the more ancient 3rd epoch, there was no lack of similar deeds. The master of the Devil Dog is at most a sequence 5. As long as anything goes wrong, to the point of nothing going wrong, he can be torn apart by a demigod or a terrifying sealed artifact. Why would he still dare to make such attempts? Or it could be said that he's simply toying with the officials and that he wouldn't act, doing it time and time again. Yes, there's another possibility. Using the threatening letter, he's able to get more than half the targets gathered together. Then, using the official Beyonder organizations' counterbalancing of each other and the procedural and bureaucratic tendencies, create a time delay. The attack on Mr. Isengard Stanton must have been handed over to the machinery hive mind, who is in charge of supernatural affairs in Hillston Borough, but the ones who killed the Devil Dog were mainly comprised of the Nighthawks. The 2 organizations definitely don't communicate in detail too much. Well, it can also be assigned based on Mr. Stanton's faith. Which deity does he believe in? I don't seem to know, nor can I tell. In short, with so many private investigators living in different districts and with different faiths, the division of jurisdiction is a troublesome matter, and joint operations aren't so easy to achieve. At this moment, the ones protecting us should only be 2 or 3 groups of official Beyonders. At the very most, they would be at the level of deacons, and they wouldn't use sealed artifacts which are too powerful or dangerous. Even a demigod high-sequence Beyonder wouldn't direct their gaze over to us that quickly. This would give the Devil Dog's master a chance. Although 3 to 4 groups of official Beyonders can definitely kill 1 or even more than 1 sequence 5, as long as he takes advantage of the situation, there's a good chance that he can successfully escape. Klein was able to deduce 2 or 3 possibilities in just 20 to 30 seconds, and giving each of them a preliminary opinion. Thinking of the divination outcome that indicated that there would be significant danger tonight, Klein thoughtfully nodded his head, closed the door, and entered the living room. He said to the sitting or standing detectives, "Have you called the police?" There are almost half of the people who were assembled back then, gathered here. He surveyed the detectives and muttered inwardly. Representing the rest, Kaslana replied, "Some have called the police, while others have tried to find Mr. Stanton or familiar friends. Finally, all of us got together and discussed about visiting you, the great detective." Klein gently nodded and deliberately said, "Everyone, don't be too nervous. The person who sent the letter should be trying to get revenge for that serial murder, but he's only one person with at most 1 or 2 companions. As for us, we have a total of 8 detectives, all skilled in combat and shooting, so why should we be afraid of him? Besides, we were not the only ones assembled by Mr. Stanton, and it must be the same for those who received the threatening letters. They just didn't end up meeting you or come to visit me. Upon hearing his words, Kaslana and her assistant, Lydia, revealed doubtful expressions, as if they were unsure of something. Another detective took a deep breath. Mr. Moriarty, perhaps it's as you say, we need not be afraid of him. But he's a sinister snake lurking in the dark. No one knows when he will launch an attack, and no one can guard against it in advance. Furthermore, he might even harm our family members. Family members? Oh, my wife. No, my little angel. The detectives were instantly overwhelmed by their emotions as they exhibited exaggerated reactions. Standing behind Klein, Stewart was trembling with fear and anger. No, I don't want that, he murmured, almost losing control of his emotions. Just as Klein and Kaslana attempted to calm them down, Stewart suddenly drew his gun and aimed it at the back of Klein's head. His eyes were glazed over, and his emotions seemed to have completely overwhelmed him. Chapter 414. Desire Apostle. While Stewart was raising his gun to aim, Klein, who had long been on guard, had already detected it. He lunged forward at the same time as Stewart performed his series of actions. Bang! Stewart, who was clearly out of control, pulled the trigger, and the bullet grazed the side of a private detective's face as it hit the wall. Instantly, the other detectives pulled out their revolvers as a result of the stress. It was as if they were looking at the enemy, turning the scene extremely chaotic. Among them, Stewart and a private detective had flushed faces and bulging veins. Their eyes burned with a mixture of fear and anger, as though they had turned into so-called devils. At this moment, Kaslana bellowed, "Stop!" Her voice wasn't loud, but it was filled with awe. It made everyone's body tremble, and they subconsciously complied. Although there was a brief moment of silence, everyone's mood didn't seem to improve. Klein had already rolled over to the other side and stood up with his revolver in his hand. His mind raced, and he couldn't afford to hide his thoughts. He planned to rely on his hallucination ability to calm down the few visitors. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Ding dong, ding dong. A few of the private detectives suddenly became alert, and their eyes revealed a hint of lucidity. The tinkling of the doorbell was like a bucket of cold water that poured over their heads. Stewart looked at the revolver in his hand and mumbled in a daze, "What was I doing just now? The official Beyonders have made their move?" Klein breathed a sigh of relief, approaching the door as he held his revolver. The moment he held the handle, the image of the person outside appeared in his mind. It was a man in a black coat and a hunter's hat. He had gray temples and a thin face, Isengard Stanton. The detective's face was somewhat pale, and his left arm was propped up near the shoulder. "He really is all right." Klein was delighted at first, but then he became cautious. He remembered the day when Nimble-Right Master Rossigo had transformed into a constable to knock at his door. Klein placed his finger on the trigger, pulled the door open, and took 2 steps back. Isengard Stanton smiled and nodded at him. "Thank you for your visit this afternoon. Otherwise, I might not have been able to continue playing hide-and-seek with that devil. You saved my life." Could it be that the correct interpretation of a suitable date for visiting Isengard Stanton is that by visiting him this afternoon, I was able to help him out of trouble? What about the next few days of suitable dates for visiting? By skirting around the murder scene, I wouldn't be suspected? Klein didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He didn't let his guard down as he made way. What exactly happened? We'll talk later. Isengard suddenly lowered his voice and laughed. Do you wish to discuss the subject of Beyonders in front of Stewart and the others? So here you are mentioning Beyonders to me so naturally? That's right, I was able to remain in a deadlock with the master of the Devil Dog for more than 10 minutes. That serves to prove that I'm no ordinary person. Besides, the suggestion I previously offered pointed straight at a devil-turned-animal. Klein quietly stayed behind Isengard Stanton by 2 steps. Upon seeing this great detective, Kaslana and her assistant, Lydia, let out a sigh of relief. Stewart and the other private detectives also showed a look of relief. "Are you all right, Mr. Stanton?" they asked. Isengard slightly moved his left arm and said, "A little injured, but not too badly." "Everyone, don't be nervous. This will be over soon. The police are waiting for that bastard in the darkness nearby." "Is it because of the serial murders? Have you locked onto the suspect? Will he hurt the innocent?" the private detectives asked frantically. Isengard pressed his right palm down. "Don't worry, I'll tell you in detail in the time to come, but before that, I need to find out a few things from Sherlock and Kaslana. We'll head to the activity room for a few minutes." His accumulated prestige made the detectives sit down without rebutting. Although they were still worried, they no longer had the problem of fretting or suddenly losing control of their emotions. After entering the activity room and closing the wooden door, Klein took a look at the enclosed room and suddenly thought of something. This kind of environment is very suitable for using items like the biological poison bottle. Klein cleared his throat, walked across the room, and opened the window. He still didn't relax his wariness against Isengard Stanton, nor did he believe that Kaslana was absolutely trustworthy. Isengard looked around, directly taking Klein's reclining chair before chuckling. "Being old, I still like to sit like this." Sitting on a single sofa, Klein asked again, "Mr. Stanton, what exactly happened?" Isengard looked at Kaslana, who was standing behind a coffee table, and said, "We're all Beyonders, so I won't explain stuff pertaining to general knowledge." "Beyonders?" Kaslana first looked at Klein, then at Isengard, slightly surprised but not all that shocked. "So it turns out that you're also a Beyonder? Why were you stumped by a weak ghost back then and unable to even discover the problem?" "Yes, perhaps she's from a sequence that isn't good at dealing with shadows or wraiths." Klein responded to her gaze. Isengard smiled and said, "I once went to the Lenberg for 4 years of studies, where I came into contact with the Beyonder world and became a believer of the god of knowledge and wisdom. After returning to Backlund, I gradually established a good relationship with the military, the Church of the Evernight Goddess, and the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery, but I didn't dare to reveal my true identity, because the mandated punishers would definitely eliminate me as a cult's heretic. On this matter, the other official organizations wouldn't help me directly, because that would be equivalent to starting a war with the Church of the Lord of Storms. As expected of the Tyrant's Church. "Tyrant?" Klein asked in passing. Isengard took out his pipe, but only sniffed the tobacco. "This is what our church internally calls the Lord of the Storms." "All right, let me first return to what happened today. The person who attacked me and delivered threatening letters to you is the master of the serial murderer from before. Heh. You should know that the murderer is a black dog of the devil sequence, especially Sherlock. You were the first to point out that the devil might be an animal." Klein smiled, neither denying nor admitting it. Kaslana also just clasped her hands together, not saying a word. Isengard shook his head and laughed. "Don't worry, I'm not an enforcer, but as a believer of the god of knowledge and wisdom, I can't preach in Backlund or officially establish an organization. I can only rely on you and others like you for help." "In other words, you can help us take the blame?" Klein mocked inwardly. Isengard continued, seeing that they were still not making any admission. "The Devil Dog's master is a Sequence 5 expert. Yes, according to what I know, the Devil Pathways Sequence 5 is Desire Apostle. They can use and control everyone's emotions and desires, enticing them to be corrupted. When facing a Desire Apostle, one mustn't have feelings that are too intense. One mustn't make or exhibit overt desires, otherwise, they'll immediately be remotely controlled by him. Otherwise, a seed might be planted in them or have it catalyze immediately. This will make people exhibit many problems as they gradually become corrupted. They might also lose control of their emotions at a critical moment and be unable to put up any resistance. This is a portion of the Beyonder powers a Desire Apostle has. I have confirmed these aspects from my battle with him." Upon hearing this, Klein suddenly understood one of the reasons why the culprit had sent out threatening letters and made such provocative actions. He wanted to anger us, making our emotions experience violent changes so that he could bury a corruption seed or catalyze our emotions, making it erupt out of control. This would make his follow-up attacks simpler and easier. Fortunately, I'm a Beyonder who has experienced many things. At that time, all I had was vigilance and caution. When Stuart and the others saw the threatening letter, their emotions clearly changed, so the Desire Apostle had planted a seed in them. If we hadn't been able to stabilize them in time, the situation would have become chaotic with the internal strife, giving the surrounding official Beyonders little time to react, and thus, giving the Desire Apostle ample opportunity. Back when I was in Isengard Stanton's house, I felt that time moved slowly. Was it a result of the magnification of my sudden increase in vigilance, tension, wariness, and other emotions? Klein thought back and felt lucky. So that's how it is. Kaslana seemed to gain an understanding of many things. Isengard rubbed his temples and said, I was almost manipulated by him, which resulted in my injuries. Afterward, I used a mystical item to play hide and seek in the house. It was only when Sherlock visited and the three sides came to a stalemate did I get a chance to have a breather. My poor assistant was looking forward to returning to Lenberg for Mass on New Year's Day. At this point he sighed. When the police arrived, I took the opportunity to escape and then used the river to escape the pursuit, Isengard added. He then asked, Sherlock, Kaslana, how do you plan on handling this issue? After a moment of silence, Kaslana said, Mr. Stanton, do you have any suggestions? Isengard said, First, take the protection of the official Beyonders, preventing the Desire Apostle from daring to take action. While this is happening, we should hope that he's quickly caught or killed. If our hopes aren't met, it's impossible that the official Beyonders would allocate people to constantly protect us. Then we only have two choices. First, it's to change our identity, including our families, and move to a different place with their help. However, no one can guarantee that the Desire Apostle won't discover this. Second, we can directly join a corresponding official organization and become an external member. That way, our identity and place of residence will change as well, but it's much safer. Join a corresponding official organization? The machinery hive mind? Or go to places like Lenberg or Mason to join the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom? Wouldn't I then come to have 3 last names? No, a believer of 3 churches? Klein felt an inexplicable sense of absurdity. He thoughtfully asked for advice. Are there no other solutions? At the same time, there was no change in Kaslana's expression. It was unknown what she was thinking. Isengard Stanton rubbed his pipe and said, Yes, that is that we join forces to create an opportunity so that we can quickly find and detain the Desire Apostle. Of course, the perfect outcome would be us killing him directly. Chapter 4:15. The Ring. Klein didn't have too big of a response in regards to Isengard Stanton's suggestion. He looked at the tightly closed door of the activity room and said, As far as I know, a devil can predict danger before we take action, and they can even determine the source of the danger, thus providing an effective response. It's hard to find and restrain him. Isengard nodded slightly and said, Yes, that's indeed the case, but this doesn't mean that there are no solutions. What solutions? Kaslana immediately asked. Isengard smiled and said, I fought him head-on and witnessed his Beyonder powers of predicting danger, so I have a rough idea of its strengths and weaknesses. A devil can indeed detect danger before it happens, and it can be done so for quite a significant period of time prior to the danger. As long as we make any plans and take decisive action that targets him, he would receive the corresponding premonition. Of course, it has to be something that can really harm him. No, the truth is that the strengths and weaknesses of different types of devils are different. Some of them might only be capable of detecting danger 10 to 20 minutes in advance. Klein silently retorted, but he didn't say it out loud. Isengard continued, The flaw of premonition powers is that it can only detect the person and location of the danger, but it doesn't know the specific details. This gives us an opportunity to take advantage of it. What opportunity? I don't think we can trap a devil that can predict danger, Kaslana asked incredulously. Klein also nodded in agreement. Of course, I can use the gray fog to deceive the Desire Apostle, making him unable to detect danger ahead of time. But the problem is, how can I expose the secret of the gray fog in front of others? Klein silently added a few words. Isengard chuckled. It's true that it won't work normally, but the Beyonder world is full of incredible things. I'm a Sequence 7 knowledge keeper of the reader pathway, also known as detective. By honestly telling you this, it's a way of showing my sincerity in cooperating. In this situation, I think honesty is more important than anything else. Only Sequence 7? How could a Sequence 7 escape from a Desire Apostle? It seems like Mr. Stanton has a powerful mystical item. Enlightened, Klein shifted in his seat. Does a knowledge keeper have the ability to suppress a devil's premonition powers? Kaslana asked with her body leaning forward. No, Isengard said with a laugh. However, I have a ring. It originates from a Sequence 6 rampager of the reader pathway. It allows me to differentiate, recognize, remember, and mimic all the Beyonder powers I've seen before. Of course, against more powerful Beyonder powers, the chance of failure is higher. There's a maxim in our church, omniscience means omnipotence. Why does it sound so familiar? Furthermore, the description of the item. Klein was about to run through his memories when he saw Isengard Stanton take out a gorgeous ring. The ring was inlaid with many small diamonds. Together, they surrounded a beautiful emerald green gem that looked like a human eye. Just by looking at this ring, Klein felt dizzy, as if he had overworked his mind. Isn't this sealed artifact 2-081? Isengard Stanton is old Mr. Eye of Wisdom? Klein looked up in surprise at the detective sitting in the reclining chair. That ring was the sealed artifact 2-081 which Eye of Wisdom had flaunted to him previously and had used several times in the Beyonder gathering. Eye of Wisdom? This code name does sound like it's related to the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. Klein, using his clown's ability to control his expression as he looked quietly at Isengard Stanton. In the end, he found that some of the outlines of the great detective did match Eye of Wisdom, but there were many details which were highly different. His ability to disguise himself is very impressive. Was it done with the help of 2-081? Klein made a rough judgment. At this moment, he suddenly thought of a scene. If Mr. Stanton says, "Let all of us work together to resist the Desire Apostle, and the most important thing is honesty." I have already described my sequence and mystical item. It's your turn. What should I say? Silently take out the sun brooch which he sold to me? At that moment, wouldn't he be going, "Nice, so it's you, punk"? While Klein was imagining things, Kaslana looked at the ring Isengard Stanton showed and asked in envy and puzzlement, "What power are you planning on mimicking to resist the Desire Apostle's ability to predict danger?" Isengard curled the corner of his lips and chuckled. The premonition that devils have towards danger. At that moment he looked like a hoary fox. That actually works? Klein was instantly momentarily unable to figure out the intricacies. Seeing Kaslana and Klein puzzled, Isengard laughed and explained, "First, which is what we're currently doing, draw up a plan that can actually harm the Desire Apostle and begin working on it. Second, the Desire Apostle will sense the danger and know that the danger comes from us and that it stems from this place. Third, as a devil, without any advanced preparations, there are certain things that are instinctual to him that he cannot change. His first reaction is definitely to kill us or to exact revenge on us, and there will be certain changes to his body, after which he will consider whether the current situation is suitable for a counterattack or not, and whether he should choose to stay away from us. Fourth, by mimicking the devil's premonition powers, I'll sense the threat of the Desire Apostle and grasp the source of danger, which is also his present location. That's some godly operation? Klein was quite surprised. But what happens next? The Desire Apostle would run away as soon as he realizes that something is wrong. We won't even have time to chase after him. Doubts immediately arose in him. Isengard looked at the two of them and smiled. According to my deductions, he must be hiding in our surroundings right now. No matter how good he is at remotely controlling the emotions of others, there must be a distance limit. And just now, he had led Stuart and the others to lose control of their emotions. After I escaped his pursuit, the reason why it took me so long to appear here was because I was discussing a plan with the Nighthawks, Machinery Hive Mind, and the military. They will each send 2 to 3 squads who are in charge of monitoring the nearby districts. These districts all have their code names. Heh, this will all be within the Desire Apostle's expectations. Even if he senses the danger, he will only treat it as normal. As soon as I confirm his location, I will inform the official Beyonders, and they will rapidly seal off the corresponding areas and close in on him. But herein lies the problem. How are we to inform the official Beyonders? If we're unable to accomplish this within seconds, the Desire Apostle will escape. Of course, he might have fled when what he just did had failed, Klein said in thought. If that's the case, we would be out of solutions as well. There's no plan that's absolutely perfect. We can only wait for a particular sealed artifact's activation process to complete. When the time comes, the Desire Apostle might have already left Backlund, but he might return at any time, Isengard explained. He then took out a golden palm-sized item. It looked like a miniature telegraph, but it also had a trumpet on it. This is a sealed artifact. It can allow my voice to sound out simultaneously up to a range of 5 kilometers. Isengard smiled as he introduced it. Its negative effect is that once it's activated, all sounds within 5 kilometers will be transmitted to the user's ears for an extended period of time. Of course, I can mimic a Beyonder power to mitigate this effect. After listening carefully, Kaslana frowned slightly. Since there are official Beyonders involved, there doesn't seem to be any need for our cooperation? Isengard carefully put on sealed artifact 2-081 and earnestly said, in order to not alarm the Desire Apostle ahead of time, there's a void of power in the nearby district. If the target is really here, the 3 of us need to help each other to retain him as best as we can. I have no problem. Klein pondered for a moment before agreeing. Kaslana also nodded and said, Mr. Stanton, there's no need for you to explain so much. After all, we'll cooperate for our own sake. An explanation is part of the plan, and an agreement means that the operation is about to begin. Isengard half closed his eyes. The emerald green gem on the ring of his right hand began to glow with a dark blue light. Suddenly, Isengard Stanton stood up, pointing upwards with a grim expression. He's right here upstairs. Klein and Kaslana stood up at the same time, one ready to snap a finger and light a match on the second floor to jump up there directly, while the other followed Isengard towards the door. None of them expected the Desire Apostle to be so bold as to remain in the vicinity after the failure of the previous machination, right in 15 Minsk Street. Maybe he was upstairs watching it all with a cold gaze while we were discussing the plan to deal with him. This thought suddenly popped up in Klein's mind. At that moment, he saw Kaslana's eyes suddenly turn red, and her right hand formed a fist as she punched out at Isengard Stanton's back where his heart was. Klein's pupils contracted as he instantly came to a realization of many things. The reason why the Desire Apostle didn't flee was because he still had other plans set up. He still had a seed of corruption in someone's heart that he didn't catalyze. That person was none other than Kaslana, one of the only 3 Beyonders here. The reason why the unsuccessful attempt at instigating them was so easily resolved was to let their guard down and wait for the critical moment to make Kaslana lose control of her emotions. The Desire Apostle's biggest target was still Isengard Stanton. How crafty! Klein snapped his fingers, but it was only an air bullet that was fired at Kaslana. At the same time, he shouted, "Be careful!" Isengard had a lot of experience too. He didn't care what the situation was as he threw himself forward. However, Kaslana ignored the bullet, allowing it to strike her arm and allowing blood to splatter everywhere. Bam! She punched Isengard in the back, throwing her entire body forward. Gotcha! Klein heard the sound of bones breaking, and the point of contact was the spine. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.